Hello everyone, this is Kawainame TV. This video is all about what if Naruto replaced Kiba in Teammate Part 4. This story is a fanfiction. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Kindly click the bell button for more updates. Welcome back to this story guys, let's go. Chapter 19. It was a very odd procession that slowly walked back to Konoha. The sand team was battered and bruised. Naruto had clones carrying Kankuro's puppet as well as Temari's fan. As reluctant as they were to give up their weapons, they relented when Gaara spoke. The Leaf Shinobi were in better shape than their captives, but most of them had used up a great deal of chakra. Even Nara Shikamaru's slouch seemed more tired than usual. Of the group, Uzumaki Naruto was the least exhausted, but even he was feeling a little drained. The seal containing his prisoner had given him a degree of unnatural stamina that most shinobi couldn't even contemplate without the aid of a lot of sake. He'd literally lost count of the number of times he'd used Kage Bunshin no Jutsu that day, the latest to form a cordon around both teams as they made their way back to Konoha. Despite all the extra eyes, Naruto was still looking around cautiously. His teammates claimed they were all right, but they looked pretty wasted to him. All but Hinata had fought in the tournament earlier that day as well, and the glimpses he'd gotten of the Hyuga girls' fight with Temari made him wince in recollection. Those two had gone after each other with a ferocity that shocked him just a little. Naruto sort of understood Temari's attitude. She'd been worried about her brother. But as he sifted through the memories from his clones, he remembered Hinata practically snarling at Temari that she wouldn't let her harm Naruto-kun. Just thinking about that gave Naruto a very odd feeling. Maybe some of his precious people considered him equally precious. Even considering the possibility made Naruto's heart pound in his chest. But he had more immediate concerns at the moment. Gaara shuffled along like the rest, and just as silent. But every so often, he would glance at Naruto out of the corner of his eye. Every time he did this, Naruto expected him to say something, but he never did. Finally, Naruto turned his head so he caught Gaara looking right in his face. The red-haired boy actually jerked back a little. Naruto could see the others flinch in response. "Is there something you'd like to ask me?" Naruto asked in what he privately called his Kurenai voice. He hoped it sounded as patient as she was. "How do you?" Gaara began, but his voice trailed off. "You have control of your demon. How did you do this?" Naruto winced as Shikamaru let out a startled cough. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Shino grasp the shadow user's elbow, his head leaning toward Shikamaru's ear. Naruto sighed. Pretty soon his prisoner would become the worst-kept secret in Konoha. "I don't," Naruto said in a slightly irritated voice. "My seal may be a little different from yours, since I don't have any kind of automatic protection, but the only time it can try to influence me is when I am pretty mad." Gaara nodded slowly, taking this in. "Yet you used its chakra several times today. I could feel it, especially when you escaped Shukaku's sand." Naruto nodded. "We sort of have a deal. It knows that if I die, it dies too. I only ask when I really need it for something, and it knows that if it refuses it will probably die. It really doesn't want to die." Gaara's eyes widened a little. "Then, I am in the same situation." He nodded slowly and resumed walking. After a moment, everyone staring at the Jinchuriki blinked and began walking as well. As they walked, Naruto noticed Temari still held her right arm at a funny angle, moving it tentatively. Even if she'd kept her fan, he doubted she could have even carried it this far. He was hardly surprised, given how many times he'd been nailed by a Juken strike. Shoulder tenketsu really sucked, because a hit to any of them tended to make the whole joint lock up. But Naruto was surprised when Hinata sidled up to the older blonde girl and spoke with her in little more than a whisper. A moment later, she handed the Suna girl a small jar she'd taken from her pocket. Temari stared after the Hyuga girl as she resumed her place in their formation, periodically activating her Byakugan to check for enemies. Privately, Naruto was glad she hadn't changed too much. It took them a little while to reach the gates of Konoha. They were halfway there when Naruto remembered the chakra-drained sound nins they'd left back in the forest. Fortunately, they weren't that far away, and he dispatched a platoon of clones to collect them. He was still a little annoyed with himself for not remembering earlier. As he finished, Shikamaru fell into step with him. Naruto steeled himself for what was likely to happen next. "Shino explained," the slouching genin said, staring up at the clouds overhead. Naruto nodded. "I think I understand how you've been slinging shadow clones around like cheap kunai. I asked Asuma about the technique and he said he wouldn't teach me until I had Jonin-level chakra reserves, or else it might kill me." He sighed. "I suppose you might just be too stupid to know when you're supposed to collapse, but that's not why, is it?" Naruto shook his head. Shikamaru was one of the few classmates he'd gotten along somewhat okay with, but now he sounded irritated. "I suppose having a demon sealed inside you would boost your chakra a lot," Shikamaru continued. It's annoying that I didn't figure it out sooner. I had all the pieces in front of me, too. Damn Aburame. His voice trailed off and he shot a glare over at Shino, who seemed oblivious. Naruto scowled. Hating him was okay, but Shino hadn't done anything but be smart. Anyway, Shikamaru continued, turning back to Naruto, you're annoying as hell at times, but hating you for something like that is stupid and troublesome. With that, the Nara boy slowed his pace a little, meandering toward the back of the group again, and leaving Naruto to continue beside the silent Gaara. As they approached the village, it was clear that the attack was over. The late afternoon air was oddly quiet without the sounds of distant explosions. Their reception at the gates of Konoha had been a little hostile. Naruto supposed he couldn't blame them for being jumpy, but he didn't think anyone in Konoha would fail to recognize him, or fail to see Hinata's eyes. Then, as soon as the older Chunin acknowledged their forehead protectors were real, they demanded that they turn over their prisoners. Naruto clenched his fists as his temper began to fray. Maybe he'd been overexposed to Jiraiya, but he especially didn't like the way the younger guard was eyeing Temari. You two are really brave, Shikamaru announced with a yawn as he stretched. He grimaced as something in his neck made an audible pop. I wouldn't have the guts to countermand a Jonin's orders. I'm sure their sensei will be impressed by your initiative, right before she busts you back to Genin. After a whispered consultation, the gatekeepers decided to let them send one of their number ahead to fetch their sensei. However, they would be responsible if their prisoners tried to escape. At that, Gaara looked up. We have surrendered, he said in a flat, emotionless tone that still managed to sound annoyed. At first, Hinata seemed like the logical person to find Kurenai-sensei as quickly as possible, until Shino cleared his throat. Naruto stared at his teammate. You tagged sensei, he demanded, incredulous. I tag everyone, Shino answered, adjusting his sunglasses. Therefore I already have a general idea of which direction to go. Shino would be faster, Hinata agreed. As their teammates slipped through the gates, Kankuro coughed. Tagged? He asked. As in, with bugs. Yeah, that's how we tracked you down, Naruto said absently. Then he snapped his mouth shut. Even if they were prisoners and that was fairly common knowledge about the Aburame, he needed to watch what he said. Temari gave a whole body shudder that made Naruto quickly look away. I'd like to slap father in the face for even thinking about attacking this place. She looked up just in time to catch Shikamaru staring. What are you looking at? She demanded. A prisoner I'm supposed to guard, Shikamaru said, just a little defensively, Naruto thought. That doesn't give you the right to ogle me, she snapped. If you'd rather take your chances with those two, Shikamaru offered, nodding off to the side toward the Chunin manning the gate. Temari tried to cross her arms and look away, but one of them still wouldn't move right. I think we should just wait for sensei, Hinata offered. You better listen to her, Temari said in a spiteful tone. She kicked my ass, she'd take you down in a heartbeat, pineapple hair. Temari, Gaara said, and she immediately subsided, looking away. After a moment, she pulled Hinata's ointment from her sash and used her left hand to work some into her right shoulder under her uniform. Kankuro edged toward where Naruto and Gaara were standing. She gets like that when she's scared or upset. We're not going to violate our parole. Parole? Naruto asked. Kankuro peered at him, maybe wondering if Naruto was making fun of him. Gaara surrendered to you. If we tried to escape now, we'd be violating his word and he'd probably have to kill or recapture us to regain his honor. Don't you do this in Fire Country? Naruto shook his head. Not that I've heard of. Maybe it's because you're the Kazekage's kids, so you're like royalty. Kankuro made a disgusted sound. Hardly. The daimyo of Wind Country hates the Kazekage. He's tried to ruin our village practically since his coronation. Naruto was about to ask more about this when there was a commotion at the entrance. Shino and Kurenai came through the gate with a dozen Anbu, but following right on her heels was an old man with one arm, swathed in bandages, who was accompanied by unfamiliar men who looked like shinobi. I understand your concerns, Danzo-sama, but my team performed the capture, and they will be turned over to Ibiki to be held until the Hokage can make a decision. Kurenai spoke as she walked, but the clipped tones warned Naruto that she was about as angry as he'd ever seen her. The Hokage is still in the hospital, and it is questionable whether he will survive, the bandaged man said, and Naruto's heart seemed to freeze in his chest. We must determine how deep this plot goes, and we must have this information immediately, no matter what steps must be taken. Hokage, hospital, questionable whether he will survive. The words seemed to echo in Naruto's suddenly empty mind. He took half a step forward and his mind was no longer empty. It was filled with red flames. It was only as the red glare seemed to settle across his eyes and he saw Sabaku no Gaara flinch away that Naruto realized what was happening. He continued walking forward, forcing down the rage, rejecting the demon's gift of chakra, ignoring the Chunin and even a few of the Anbu as they stopped to stare at him. Duty. Do your duty, he reminded himself. Don't embarrass Sensei. Don't embarrass your team. His voice was almost normal as he stopped several paces in front of the procession. Uzumaki Naruto, reporting for duty, Sensei. We have apprehended the Suna team, who surrendered to us. We also neutralized a team of sound shinobi that tried to intercept us. I have clones bringing them to this gate for processing. Very good, Naruto, Kurenai replied. She turned to the bandaged man. I think that presents us with a compromise that won't violate orders. Danzo-sama, your men can process the Sound Nin team while we secure the Kazekage's children. We don't want to risk triggering a diplomatic incident before we have all the facts, do we? Danzo gave her a long, measuring look. I see that Sarutobi's subordinates are just as wedded to his vision of the world. Very well, I will abide by his authority while he still lives. But keep in mind that we have reports that one of his charity cases cost him his arm. Be careful you don't earn yourself a similar fate from your pet. Jonin, of your skills are hard to come by. Kurenai inclined her head politely, then gestured for her team to follow her. Naruto's clones picked up the fan and the puppet while the Suna genin shuffled over. Once they were through the gate, Naruto noticed the signs of battle only hours past. There were scorch marks on walls, and the odd crater in the street. The memories of the clones that he'd left behind to help told him that no quarter of Konoha had been spared at least some damage. He decided to let his remaining clones keep an eye out while he asked the question burning in his mind. Sensei, he whispered, what happened to Hokage-sama? Kurenai sighed. He was attacked by the Kazekage, who turned out to be Orochimaru in disguise. They were sealed behind a barrier no one could get through, except for one of the proctors. Both the Hokage and Orochimaru lost their right arms, and Orochimaru was forced to flee. Most of the fighting in Konoha stopped after that. There are indications that the Sand Shinobi were deceived by Orochimaru. Our father is dead, Gaara said in a flat voice, making Naruto jump. His hearing was much better than Naruto had thought possible. His words also made his siblings jump, turning to him with wide eyes. He would not have allowed himself to be replaced in such a manner if he was still alive. If Konoha was to be humbled, he would want to be there when it happened. Both Kankuro and Temari looked shocked, but neither one disagreed. That is what most of the Suna Jonin said when they surrendered after the barrier went down, Kurenai said. But it will take some time to sort things out and let the Hokage come to a decision. So, he's going to be okay? Naruto asked, hating the hopeful, wheedling tone in his voice. His arm was frozen to prevent poison from spreading through his body, Kurenai said, but the medics have every confidence that he will fully recover. Naruto let out a sigh of relief. Despite the signs of damage to his home, he knew everything would be all right. When they arrived at the detention center, Naruto had to bite back a laugh. The shinobi who'd conducted the written exam was also in charge of the Anbu torture and interrogation force. Figures. A glance to the side showed a sour grimace on Shikamaru's face as well. Shino's expression, if any, was hidden behind that damn collar, and Hinata-chan was far too polite to say something. Unless she got mad, of course. What was more interesting were the looks Ibiki exchanged with Kurenai-sensei. They seemed to know each other, though Naruto was having trouble guessing why Kurenai looked so amused and Ibiki looked like he'd drunk bad milk. I suppose I should have guessed your troublemakers would be out raising hell, Yuhi, Ibiki growled. Then Naruto remembered his brash words at the end of the written exam and swallowed. Oh well, at least sensei didn't look angry. That had to count for something, right? They acquired some very high-profile prisoners, Ibiki-san, Kurenai said with a slight smile. Then her face turned serious. The Hokage will want them handled very carefully. Danzo-sama has already expressed an interest in them. Ibiki frowned, pulling tight the cloth he wore tied across his ruined scalp. Naruto hoped it didn't pop loose, seeing that once was enough. Who the hell did they bag? I am Sabaku no Gaara, Gaara said tonelessly, accompanying his words with a formal bow. I have given parole, along with my sister and brother, he added in that affectless voice that still gave Naruto chills. He hoped Gaara didn't forget what they'd talked about in the forest. Ibiki only blinked once. That explains a lot. I have a place we can keep them until the Hokage can make a decision. Will they be allowed visitors? Naruto blurted out before he completely thought it through. Not normally, Ibiki replied, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Naruto. Why do you ask? It might be important, Naruto replied evasively. For reasons I cannot discuss. I also think Jiraiya should see him as well. Naruto floundered for a moment. For safety reasons, he added lamely. Ibiki turned to Kurenai, but Naruto's sensei was staring at him curiously. Does this have something to do with the Hokage's special law? She asked. Naruto nodded quickly. How urgent is it that Jiraiya come here? She asked. Very urgent, Naruto replied. Something might need to be fixed, and it might be a good idea for me to check on it until he's had a look. Kurenai's eyes flicked over the prisoners, and then she turned to Ibiki and nodded. He raised an eyebrow, but nodded back. Naruto thought it was interesting that the special Jonin was evidently willing to accept Kurenai's assessment over his own opinions. All right, he finally said. I can arrange visiting hours once a day. Noon. Naruto nodded gratefully, and then turned to Gaara, who had witnessed the whole conversation silently. I'll bring you guys lunch or something. Temari and Kankuro just looked confused. Very, very confused. Ooh. This convenes an emergency session of the village council for Konohagakure, Homaru announced in a dry, but steady voice. Is this even proper? A voice asked uncertainly. I mean, we barely have a quorum here. Hyuga Hiyashi quickly rose to his feet, directing a glare at the questioner. The silk merchant flinched visibly. Though prosperous, a good portion of his income flowed from Hyuga coffers and he knew it. The treacherous attack on our village requires swift action if we are to properly discharge our responsibilities to Konoha, he said in a chilly voice, clearly daring anyone there to disagree. That is correct, Hiyashi-sama, echoed Maniki Gawabara, the head of the ancient money changers guild. In modern times, they controlled all of the village's banks, including the large cash reserves that served as a foundation for Konoha's economy, as well as guaranteeing the village's credit. What is our first order of business then? Asked Yoshikawa Toshiro. He owned a large chain of retail shops scattered throughout Konoha. Directly and indirectly, his businesses supplied most of the equipment used by Anbu and the other shinobi. The first is to declare the Chunin examination cancelled, rasped Danzo. I've always counseled that inviting foreign shinobi into the heart of our village was a mistake, despite what some may claim. We no longer have time to deal with this misguided policy when Konoha itself is in danger. This will anger some of the clans, Mochizuki Hiro, the representative of the agricultural guilds, observed. He gestured toward the empty chairs normally occupied by representatives of the more prominent ninja clans, including the Aburame and the Nara. They will have the opportunity to test again in 6 months, Hyuga Hiyashi countered smoothly. Or whenever the new Hokage decides to resume them. We will vote by a show of hands. All in favor raise your right hands. The vote was quickly taken. Secret ballots were normally reserved only for the most sensitive of decisions. In this case, the abbreviated council was unanimous in their decision. The motion passes, Hiyashi announced. The Chunin examination is cancelled and will be reconvened only at the Hokage's order. He nodded toward the door and a Hyuga branch family Chunin left to post the council's decree. Which brings us to our next item of business, Danzo added. With Sarutobi incapacitated by his former student's attack, we find ourselves leaderless. I'm sure you are willing to do whatever it takes, Danzo, a gravelly voice said from the entrance to the council chamber. Fortunately, such steps will not be necessary. The bandaged face of the root leader showed almost no reaction as he turned, but the minute widening of his visible eye spoke volumes to those that knew him. There were reports that you were on your deathbed, the one-armed man said. His tone implied he wasn't too thrilled to find them to be false. Reports of my death were exaggerated, the Sandaime said as he slowly walked into the chamber. The medics were able to save my life, if not my arm. He was trailed by a blank-faced medic Nin and one of the Chunin proctors from the exam. Those two were flanked by a small group of Chunin, including the pair that normally guarded the doors to his office. I see, Hiyashi said coolly. Then I must congratulate you on your survival. However, it is clear that you are no longer capable of fulfilling some of the more strenuous duties required by your office. The silence that followed that statement was absolute. Hyuga Hiyashi wasn't quite challenging the Hokage, but only by the barest of margins. Several of the council members shivered slightly. The room seemed to have grown quite chilly in the last few moments. You are quite right, the Sandaime said, breaking the silence. He smiled slightly. I will be making arrangements to have my chosen successor brought here soon. In the meantime, I know all of you must be worried about your homes and families. I appreciate your dedication in making sure Konoha isn't left leaderless in the face of this crisis, but as I am no longer incapacitated, it is no longer necessary for you to exercise your emergency powers. It wasn't quite a dismissal, but the Hokage's tone was clear. In that case, we will adjourn, Hiyashi said. The cold smile he wore as he stepped away from the podium was only marginally short of offensive. Sarutobi's eyes lingered on each of the council members as they left. Many of them refused to meet his eyes, looking down as they quickened their steps. Danzo was the last to leave, and he met the Hokage's gaze squarely. This isn't over, Danzo said. His eyes lingered on the empty sleeve of the Hokage's robes. No, it isn't, Sarutobi agreed. After the root leader shuffled out and the door closed, the Hokage suddenly sagged, and might have fallen if Haku hadn't appeared at his remaining elbow to steady him. Hokage-sama, I told you this was ill-advised, the dark-haired medic Nin fretted as he ran a glowing hand across the chest of the old man's robes of office. You have not fully recovered from your hypothermia. The last he said with a sympathetic glance toward the Chunin, who nonetheless winced. Sarutobi coughed once before he sat down in one of the recently vacated chairs. I agree, but it was still necessary. If I had stayed under your care at the hospital, there is no telling what mischief they would have gotten up to. He sighed. As it was, we didn't get here in time to stop their first decree. Surely canceling the examination was justified under the circumstances, Hokage-sama, one of the Chunin guards exclaimed. Perhaps, Sarutobi said, but I think I saw enough in the time I did have to make some recommendations to the proctors. He sighed. There would still be some questions as to the validity of the tests, since some participants were clearly not there for honest competition. Nothing to be done about it now. This was not a fight he could afford, not with everything else happening. His lips pressed together in a thin line as he levered himself to his feet. Lingering here too long would reveal too much to his enemies. For a brief moment, he wished Konoha was more like other villages, where Akage's word was absolute and he could overturn even the most lawful exercise of power by the council when it suited him. He shook his head. That wasn't what he and the others had fought so long for. In the aftermath of the attack, the genin teams were mobilized en masse to assist with the cleanup. It felt very strange to Naruto to not be on the intensive training schedule he'd followed prior to the finals of the Chunin exam. Instead, Kurenai-sensei met them first thing in the morning with a long list of assigned tasks. Normal mission pay was reduced in light of the crisis, but no one even thought of complaining. Teammates spent most of their days on street repairs, patching up battle-damaged walls, and doing their best to eradicate any signs of the invasion. The work seemed to be endless, but Naruto found that he didn't really mind. It felt good to have something concrete he could do to make things better. He was a little disappointed when he received word of the examination being cancelled, but in light of everything that happened, he couldn't really complain. Konoha recovering from the invasion had to have the highest priority. Kurenai-sensei emphasized that when she told them the news, and Naruto supposed that only made sense. An unworthy part of his soul was a little disappointed. He thought he'd made a good enough showing that they could have passed him if they wanted to. On the other hand, if he participated in another exam, he'd have a chance to fight in front of the crowd again. At least, he would if it was held in Konoha. He'd never forget what it felt like to have all those people cheering him like that. Even if he wanted to whine, any urges to do so would have fled the instant he saw the old man at the Hokage's tower after their 5th day of repair work. They had finished early that day, having completed more missions than Kurenai-sensei had expected. Naruto had been feeling restless with the lack of training, and their tasks that day were mainly ones that benefited from throwing dozens of cage bunshin at them. Filling in 15 potholes at once had really sped things up. Seeing the Hokage with those deep lines etched on his face and an empty sleeve really drove it home for Naruto. He tried to speak, but no words would come out. The Sandaime looked up wearily from his paperwork. He smiled a little when he saw teammate, but it was a weary expression that sat heavily on his face. He'd been too slow to prevent the council from cheating the boy out of his rightful promotion. There was little doubt in his mind that Uzumaki Naruto was ready for Chunin rank. The skills he'd displayed in the arena showed a remarkable degree of growth. Part of him was annoyed that he'd never pressed Yuhi Kurenai to join the Ninja Academy as a Chunin, but part of him was equally happy that she'd been available when Naruto really needed a skilled mentor. The only mark against the boy was the conclusion of his first match, and given the lethal techniques the Hyuga boy had attempted, he could hardly hold that against him. He knew full well why the match had been so vicious, but he could hardly meddle in clan affairs and maintain his neutrality as the Hokage for the entire village. That was why he was equally glad to see young Hyuga Hinata return to semi-active status for D-rank missions. If her sensei felt she needed to supervise the last stages of her physical therapy, who was he to disagree? Still, the cancellation of the exams felt like yet another failure on his part to look out for the boy. Kurenai's reports regarding how badly he was treated by certain villagers had left a worm of guilt gnawing at the pit of his stomach. His actions, or rather inactions, had given the boy more than enough reason to hate him by now. Still, he had to face up to the consequences. That was one of the first lessons he'd learned from his predecessors. Naruto froze in place for a long moment in the doorway to his office, and the Hokage steeled himself for bitter recriminations. Then the doorway was empty and the boy was standing beside his desk. Gods, but he'd gotten fast. Haku's fist was drawn back with Senbon glittering between the fingers before he saw the Hokage's hand sign to stand down. Naruto's arms were wrapped around his ribs in a hug that made them creak. The Sandaime remembered consoling a young Maida guy after his sensei had been killed on a mission. The boy's strength was at least comparable, and he quickly patted Naruto on the shoulder to console him. Overwhelming emotion could make a taijutsu powerhouse forget their own strength, and the last thing he needed now was broken ribs. Still, when the boy raised his tear-streaked face, the Hokage felt better, lighter, than he had in weeks. Naruto clearly forgave him his failures. Perhaps he could come to forgive himself. He looked over at Jiraiya, who was lounging next to the door. He hoped he was doing the right thing. Naruto straightened up and sniffed, a little embarrassed by his impulsive outburst. But seeing the old man looking so old just tore through him like a kunai. He was even missing an arm like everyone said, and he was still here doing Hokage things like paperwork and mission briefings. Kurenai-sensei had talked to him a few times about what being the Hokage really meant. She wasn't so much trying to talk him out of it, he realized after a while, but she wanted him to realize exactly what he was letting himself in for. But nothing underlined her lessons quite so well as seeing the old man sitting at his desk, doing paperwork a little awkwardly with his left hand. The old man gave Naruto a kindly smile as he scuttled back to his team, and some of the deeper creases in his face seemed to lighten. He should smile more often, Naruto decided. As he got back in line, avoiding Kurenai-sensei's eyes, he noticed a new Chunin standing in the back corner of the room. She was pretty, with long, dark hair, and she looked vaguely familiar to Naruto as she tucked something into her sleeve. Then he remembered the proctor at the written exam that had escorted him to the bathroom. He hoped she wasn't mad about his little trick. He shrugged. She shouldn't have followed him into the bathroom in the first place. Naruto was also a little surprised to see the old pervert leaning against the wall next to the door. He still gave the man a silent, but respectful, nod. Literature aside, Naruto admitted his lecherous ninjutsu teacher had shown his serious side during the invasion. According to rumor, he'd killed hundreds of sound and sand troops that were attacking the walls. Naruto overheard a bandaged Chunin claim that the survivors would never be able to look at a toad without screaming in terror. Naruto thought he might have been exaggerating, but then again, he never wanted to get on the wrong side of Gamabunta-sama, so maybe it was true. Jiraiya had also done Naruto a personal favor and looked at Gaara's seal. It actually hadn't taken that much persuasion, once Naruto explained that he didn't think the seal was functioning correctly. The only things the Toad Hermit took as seriously as chasing women were jutsu and sealing techniques. The next day when he and some clones were bringing ramen to the holding cells, he saw Gaara sleeping so deeply that he could not be roused. His siblings were petrified, convinced he'd been poisoned or that Shukaku was busy consuming Gaara's soul. Naruto finally had to tell them, in low tones, that the crazy old man who'd examined Gaara had taught the one who made Naruto's own seal. The next day, Gaara was awake, but drowsy. He seemed very odd. Quiet and remote, but every so often he'd focus his attention so fiercely on what someone was saying that it was like a physical force. He did this most often with Naruto when he was there, much to the relief of his siblings. When Naruto got up to leave, Gaara asked him to thank Jiraiya-sama. Naruto quietly promised to do so, ignoring how shocked Temari was at her brother's humble tone. Jiraiya had been unusually pensive when Naruto's clone tracked him down to pass on the message. Remember this when someone asks you why you serve Konoha, was all the old pervert would say before dispelling the clone. Kurenai thought she'd broken the news about the Hokage's condition as gently as she could, given the circumstances. But Naruto's reaction when they entered the office only showed that it hadn't fully sunk in yet. But after seeing the Hokage's reaction, she couldn't bring herself to chastise her student for his lapse in decorum. She reminded herself that the two of them had a relationship that far predated her taking Naruto on as a student. Something seemed to pass between the two of them, and some of the jagged tension seemed to drain out of her Hokage. Maybe the Sandaime had really needed that hug. And maybe Uzumaki Naruto was just a little more perceptive than she gave him credit for. We have completed our assigned tasks, Hokage-sama, she said with a hint of pride. Her genin had worked especially hard that day, and they deserved to know that she was proud of them. Good, good, the Hokage said, fumbling with his pipe. He sighed and tapped out the ashes and set it down. I was about to send a runner out to find you, so this is fortuitous. He leaned back in his chair a little. I've asked Jiraiya to locate my successor and bring them back to Konoha, and he's asked for a genin to assist with locating her. Your clones should make it a lot easier to find her, boy, Jiraiya added casually. The Hokage leaned back in his chair and smiled, a trifle grimly. There was also the added benefit of getting Naruto out of the village while they investigated the death threats Yumi no Iruka had reported overhearing during the examination. They might have just been idle talk, but the people present were rich and powerful enough to take it seriously, especially during a transition of leadership when all manner of folly might be attempted. Naruto brightened a little with excitement, but subsided almost as quickly, shooting troubled glances at his teammates. The Sandaime nodded to himself. It spoke volumes about the boy's character that he immediately thought of his teammates, but future missions wouldn't always be with the same comrades every time. Very well, Hokage-sama, Kurenai injected crisply. Team 8 will continue with reconstruction and repair missions, though I'm not sure we will be able to handle as many per day. Naruto straightened up immediately, the Hokage noted with an inner smile. That is understood, we will adjust the assignments accordingly, he said. He suspected they'd been using large numbers of Naruto's clones as brute force labor. Team 8 was completing more tasks per day than any other Genin or Chunin formation in Konoha, something he'd been pleased to point out to a number of people who had grumbled about their task assignments. Then the Hokage glanced down at the formal scroll sitting on the corner of his desk. He'd left it there as a reminder of a less pleasant matter. With the fallout from the examination and Hyuga Neji, he could only push Hiashi so far on this matter. One other item has come up. Is Hyuga Hinata recovered sufficiently to return to full active status? I've had an inquiry from her family. Kurenai stiffened a little. She knew the Hokage had seen through her little subterfuge, but she thought he'd quietly approved of keeping Hinata away from her father a little longer. Undoing years of abuse was impossible in such a short time, but just staying in a supportive environment was having positive effects on her emotional equilibrium. And from the way her students' shoulders were drawing in, the prospect of returning to her clan was not a welcome one. But she could not lie to her Hokage. She is, mostly recovered, Hokage-sama. I see, the Hokage said quietly. If she has finished with her therapy regimen, then she should probably return to her home. Naruto glanced at Hinata out of the corner of his eye, trying for once not to be completely obvious. His teammate did not say a word, but her face bore the pinched, closed-in expression she donned in the hospital when he'd persuaded her to tell him about the Hyugas. Naruto turned to look at Jiraiya. The old Lekker's face bore an unusually grim expression. Something was up with this retrieval mission, but he wasn't about to tell him anything here. Naruto quickly weighed the pros and cons. If it was too dangerous, they'd veto what he was about to propose. But if he wasn't around, he couldn't really look after his friend. Shino would do his best, no doubt of that, but it wasn't quite the same. He had to at least try. If we need to find someone, wouldn't it be good to have Hinata's Byakugan along? Naruto asked, swallowing when he noticed all the adults looking at him. She's a lot more, observant than I am, he finished lamely. The Hokage, Jiraiya, and Kurenai-sensei all exchanged glances, but Naruto had no idea what unspoken conversation was taking place. That's not a bad point, boy, Jiraiya grunted after a moment. Even if it is an excuse to bring your. I agree, Kurenai added sharply, cutting the old hermit off, much to Naruto's relief. For this type of reconnaissance mission, having Hinata present would definitely speed things up, and bring all of you back to Konoha faster. She turned to Shino with an apologetic glance. If I have never had an opportunity to tag the objective, Shino noted, my presence would not make a noticeable difference in achieving the mission objectives. Logically, I should remain here with Kurenai-sensei. Kurenai gave Shino an approving nod and turned back to the Hokage. The addition of Hyuga Hinata to the special mission would seem to make sense, Hokage-sama. The Sandaime nodded after a moment. Duly noted. I will inform her father that she has the honor of being selected to help retrieve the Godime Hokage. Naruto resisted the urge to cheer. Seeing Hinata's face out of the corner of his eye, watching it relax as a small smile formed on her lips, made it even harder. Kurenai dismissed her team for the rest of the day. Naruto and Hinata would need a little time to prepare to leave in the morning. Shino, on the other hand, would assist his parents in repairing some damage to the Aburame compound. As soon as the genin filed out of the Hokage's office, she turned toward the two older men. With your permission, Hokage-sama, I would like a few moments to brief Jiraiya-sama with respect to my genin. The Sandaime's lips twitched minutely around his pipe, but he just nodded. Jiraiya had a ridiculous grin on his face as he followed her to an unused conference room. He spoke up as soon as the door closed behind them. Well, I didn't think this would happen so quickly, seeing as how we really got off on the wrong foot, but Jiraiya-sama, Kurenai replied crisply. I know you cannot possibly be as large a fool as your public persona acts. Please do us both a favor and drop the act for the next 10 minutes. Neither of us really has the time to waste on idle posturing. Jiraiya blinked once, and then his eyes hardened. Very well, Jonin. What did you wish to discuss? Naruto. And your behavior towards him. Jiraiya crossed his arms. Go on, he said. Uzumaki Naruto has no primary male role model at this point in his life. The Hokage has behaved in a grandfatherly role in the past, but his duties make him too remote, and now that Naruto is a genin, the differences in rank are coming between them. Yumino Iruka is a good man, but his contact with Naruto has lessened considerably since he left the academy. Made a guy, she broke off and shuddered. Jiraiya grimaced and nodded. Guy is a good example of hard work and discipline, but even Naruto is aware of his eccentricities and social shortcomings. You, on the other hand, are a well-respected shinobi with a legendary reputation. You are highly knowledgeable in ninjutsu, an aspect of shinobi training in which Naruto has the capacity to excel. You also aren't infected with the idiocy that made many in this village treat the boy as a pariah. Kurenai's voice trailed off. But, Jiraiya prodded her, his voice flat. Kurenai's voice was even as she continued, with no hint of anger leaking out. But in many ways your behavior is even more deplorable than Guy's. Like it or not, that young man looks up to you, and will likely do so more as time passes and you continue to work together. He's had nothing but positive things to say about the things you've taught him, and that advanced Doden Jutsu probably saved his life. But I'm concerned about what he might learn from you besides Jutsu. Jiraiya's scowl deepened, drawing his eyebrows together. Don't you think you're overreacting? No, Kurenai said softly, I am not. There are things that might be acceptable for you that are not acceptable coming from Uzumaki Naruto. If you think polite behavior is going to make people stop hating him for the Kyuubi, you're a fool, Jiraiya scoffed. Kurenai shook her head. I'm not talking about acceptable for Naruto the Jinchuriki, I'm talking about Naruto the Hokage. Jiraiya stared at her. You really believe his boasting about becoming Hokage? Kurenai shrugged, something she hadn't done in a long time. It was odd. When Jiraiya acted seriously, he reminded her of her old sensei. At first, I wasn't sure. It was his overriding goal when he left the academy, so I decided to take it seriously and phrase everything he needed to do to improve in terms of how it would advance him toward that goal. Even if he changed his mind later, he'd still be a better shinobi for it. She shook her head. But he's worked at a pace that I find almost frightening. He's improved so much in such a short time, and now his goal doesn't seem so far-fetched. If you had any idea what a mess he was at the academy. I know exactly how bad he was, Jiraiya said with a growl. The old man didn't take me too seriously when I said something was going on there. Kurenai looked up, her eyes glinting. How did you know? I checked up on him, secretly, whenever I returned to Konoha to report to the Hokage, Jiraiya said. Then he added, he is my godson, after all. The Sannin winced a little at the spike of killing intent that tore through the room. You are his godfather, Kurenai said, taking a step toward him, and you left him to be raised like this. What the hell is wrong with you? He's alive, Jiraiya replied coolly. He probably wouldn't be if I'd claimed him. I have too many enemies and so did his father. He spat to one side, knocking over a wastepaper basket. I'm not happy about how things turned out, but it could have been a lot worse. I've also spent damn near every day of the last 10 years working to protect my godson. Ask the Hokage about an organization called Akatsuki, you should be cleared for it, given your relationship to Naruto. And while you're at it, ask him how many times he's talked me out of eliminating half the council. With that, Jiraiya turned and angrily stalked toward the door. Wait, Kurenai's voice stopped him as he was reaching toward the doorknob. His father, gods, the fourth really did have a son, didn't he? Jiraiya turned back toward her with a grimace. Me and my big mouth, he sighed. Congratulations, he growled, you've stumbled across another S-class secret. If this gets out, half the hidden villages will be sending assassination teams within the week. But you won't have to worry about that because I'll kill you myself. It won't get out because of me, Kurenai snapped back. But if the resemblance gets any stronger, people will start to assume things like that Iowa Border Patrol. Jiraiya shook his head. I suppose you're right about that. All we can do is really just buy him as much time as we can before things come to a head. At the rate he's improving, Kurenai observed, I think he's got a good chance. Maybe, Jiraiya grunted sourly. Which brings me back to my original point, Kurenai continued. I don't think it's going to help Naruto as a Hokage if he has a reputation as a pervert. Alright, I can understand in your case why it might make an acceptable cover, but for such a, why are you laughing, she demanded. Jiraiya was actually doubled over, holding his stomach. With a mighty effort, he stifled his laughter, save for an occasional chortle, and straightened up, wiping the tears from his eyes. I'm sorry, but that's the funniest thing I've heard all day. I don't see what's so funny, Kurenai said. Every time I publish a new masterpiece of adult entertainment, he explained, his grin widening with every word, I reserve the first 30 copies to be shipped back to old friends in Konoha. Number 1 is always personally signed, with a dedication to my old sensei. Kurenai hung her head, pinching the bridge of her nose as she struggled to rid her mind of the image of Hokage-sama reading an orange book and giggling like Kakashi. She failed miserably. Being a genjutsu master required a vivid and detailed imagination. Times like this made her wonder why she hadn't become a seamstress like her mother wanted. Kurenai sighed. She wondered if the break room had any coffee left. Maybe some aspirin. All right, let me rephrase. I think it would be a liability for a Hokage to be publicly known as a pervert. There are already stories going around about some strange sex change jutsu he developed at the academy, but I think those will just be treated as youthful pranks. Naruto's already going to face an uphill challenge getting most of Konoha to accept him. Do you want to make it even harder for him? Jiraiya sighed. All right, you've made your point. I'll keep a handle on my cover activities when he's around. All right, Kurenai nodded. Thank you. The only other thing I wanted to discuss was his friends. Look, I agreed to take an extra genin so he won't feel too lonely. I don't see what the problem is. Kurenai paused for a moment to collect her thoughts. I'm going to bend on a few personal confidences here. This information is for your ears only, understood? Jiraiya nodded, rolling his eyes. Hyuga Hinata is the oldest daughter of the clan head, but I doubt she will ever be confirmed as heir. She's been subjected to systematic emotional abuse for most of her life, punctuated by what seems to be plausibly disguised episodes of physical abuse. I've considered removing her from active duty, but missions appear to be her only escape from an abusive environment. Confined to the Hyuga compound, I'd give her less than a year before, accidentally dying, either by her own hand or someone else's. Jiraiya's eyes hardened as she spoke. I'd also estimate a greater than even chance of Naruto, and possibly Shino, engaging in unauthorized retaliation were that to happen, no matter the consequences. Jiraiya's eyes widened. It's that serious. It can be, Kurenai replied. If you checked up on Naruto, then you know he's had no friends his own age up until now. Imagine how close he's become to his teammates, his first friends. Jiraiya closed his eyes for a moment, and Kurenai winced. The breakup of the Densetsu no Sannin was well known, but she hadn't intended to open old wounds. To their credit, Kurenai continued after a moment, his teammates appear to be just as loyal. Shino confronted his clan elders regarding slanderous rumors spread about Naruto, even threatening to leave the clan if what I heard was true. Jiraiya's eyebrows went up at that. After his first kill, Naruto was actively contemplating suicide, due in part to some active sabotage performed by the Academy's psychological counselor. Kurenai tightened her jaw and continued, despite the rage that purpled Jiraiya's face. Hinata got him to open up before he did anything drastic and convinced him that he wasn't a monster. And then she got me to talk to him as well. Don't worry, that counselor was remanded to Ibiki as soon as we returned to Konoha. Jiraiya calmed himself with a visible effort. She seems like a nice girl, if a bit quiet, he said after a moment. She loves Naruto unreservedly, Kurenai replied, or at least to the extent that someone with her problems is capable of loving anyone. One of her happiest memories is of Naruto telling her she was his best friend. But he doesn't consider her as a girlfriend? Jiraiya asked, both puzzled and mildly offended. He isn't, you know, is he? Kurenai frowned. Hinata, for a variety of reasons, is afflicted with crushing shyness. For that matter, Naruto has only now acquired his first friends. How would he ever have had a chance to learn what love is? She asked sadly. Jiraiya looked slightly ill. The more I learn, the more I second-guess the plan we put together to keep Naruto safely anonymous. Kurenai peered at the Sannin. For an instant, she saw past the gruff exterior of the Toad Hermit and saw a middle-aged man grieving for lost opportunities. I suppose hindsight is always 20/20, she said after a moment. But I can't argue with the fact that he is alive today. Your plan wasn't a complete failure. Jiraiya nodded, slowly straightening back up. I suppose it wasn't. And I get your point. I won't tease either of them. Much, anyway. If I completely stopped, Naruto would know something was up. He's a lot sharper than he lets on, isn't he? Yes, Kurenai agreed with a smile. He's surprised me more than once. For once, Naruto was eating alone at Ikiraku's. Shino had excused himself as soon as they left the Hokage's office. The Aburame compound had suffered some serious damage during the attack, and several of the breeding colonies had been damaged when an incubator heating unit exploded. His clan didn't begrudge time spent on cleanup missions for Konoha, but he did feel obligated to help out as much as possible. Naruto offered to come along and lend some clones to help, but it seemed that the most time-intensive activity remaining involved sorting out the colonies that had been mixed together and making sure that they didn't accidentally interbreed. To Naruto's eyes, most Kikai bugs looked alike, and he reluctantly agreed that he'd be pretty useless. Shino had, however, thanked him for the offer, and promised to let him know if they had any brute force jobs left. Hinata, on the other hand, needed to pack up her belongings at Kurenai's house, as well as prepare for their mission tomorrow. She seemed a little distressed at leaving Naruto to eat alone, but she said she wasn't really that hungry. Naruto also knew that she tended to be a little obsessive when it came to packing for an extended mission, worrying that she'd forget something they desperately need once they were gone. It was kind of odd for Naruto, knowing someone well enough that he could guess why she did something without even asking. He'd almost been that close to Iruka at the academy, but he hadn't really understood him until that night in the forest with Mizuki. It was kind of comforting, he supposed, to know someone that well. Maybe it wasn't the predictability so much as what it symbolized, a really close friendship. He was glad he'd found a way to delay her having to go back to her family. It would be good to have someone to talk to while they traveled. Jiraiya was okay, for an old guy, and he was a good teacher as well, but Hinata was, well, Hinata. Besides, the smile of relief on her face was worth any amount of fast talking. And it wasn't so bad having a quiet meal by himself. Ikiraku's was completely untouched during the invasion. It seemed that some of his stray clones ended up congregating on that particular street after their primary objectives were accomplished. Naruto didn't think it was a coincidence of any sort, but he wasn't about to admit it to anyone who asked. Still, he was glad that Toiki's stand hadn't been damaged at all, and the old man responded to his good fortune by offering half-price ramen to anyone working on village repairs. Nonetheless, he'd been a little surprised by the extra warm greeting he received the first time Team 8 visited after the exam. It hadn't even occurred to him that people would bet on the examination matches, but it warmed his heart to know that Toiki and Ayame believed in him enough to bet their savings on him. The fact that Iruka-sensei had organized the betting pool, and evidently become quite rich from it, completely scandalized the genin. What happened to the straight-laced academy teacher that lectured him about proper behavior? Imitating a foreigner to skin the rich bastards of Konoha. Naruto reminded himself to have a few words with his old sensei the next time he saw him. Still, things were looking good as he started on his fourth bowl of miso ramen. He had an important mission tomorrow. Hinata wouldn't have to deal with her crappy family for a few more days. He might even get Ero Sennin to teach them a cool jutsu. And to be honest, he was getting a little bored with D-rank repair missions, no matter how necessary they might be. Naruto was just drinking down the broth when he glanced up to see Ayame frown, looking over his shoulder. There had better not be any trouble in here, she said coolly, then turned away from the counter. Naruto looked to his side as Hyuga Neji carefully sat down on the stool next to him. The branch family prodigy was moving a little unsteadily, like he'd been off of his feet for several days, and a bulky bandage was wrapped around his head, completely covering his forehead. He was also dressed in a plain white robe Naruto was fairly sure came from the hospital. He'd seen Hinata wearing one long enough. Naruto didn't say a word as Ayame took his bowl away and brought him a fifth serving. She didn't ask Neji if he wanted anything, and her facial expression was coldly proper. Naruto wondered if it bothered Neji at all, being treated here like Naruto was treated in a lot of restaurants in Konoha. If it did bother the Hyuga boy, he didn't show it. Naruto started on his noodles, pausing only after a couple of minutes when Neji finally spoke. Your final blow left a large scar, he said quietly. Naruto resumed his meal after a moment. He wasn't precisely being rude. Neji hadn't asked him a question yet. The caged bird seal was completely obliterated when the skin was ripped away, Neji continued after a moment. That shouldn't be possible, but the medic nins think a burst of chakra might have disrupted the seal as the blow was struck. Naruto resumed eating after Neji fell silent again. Neji took a deep breath after a couple of moments. That's equally impossible, at least not without killing me, unless there was something very strange about the chakra that was used. But given how you recovered from having your tenketsu closed, that is not very surprising. He turned on his seat, facing directly toward Naruto. The scar that formed is also suffused with chakra. When the elders tried to reapply my seal, that chakra disrupted the attempt. At this point, the medic nins insisted that further attempts would be too dangerous, and when Hiyoshi-sama insisted, the Hokage asserted his authority on the matter. My uncle tried to have me immediately removed from the hospital, but the request was refused. Naruto finished his ramen, drinking down the last of the broth. He wiped his lips and turned to face Neji, going over the speech he'd worked out with Shino. Is there something you wanted to ask me, or did you just come here to bore me with your medical history? It was a little weird, but he sort of enjoyed using that snide tone. Shino said it would annoy Neji a lot more than overt rudeness. Neji's eyes narrowed a little, but he showed no other signs of anger. I left the hospital because I wanted to know why. You freed me from the seal that has enslaved my family for generations. I now owe you a debt of honor, but I want to know one thing. Why did you do this? The reserved Genin's voice became a little rougher at the end, but he still spoke in little more than an intense whisper. Naruto looked directly into Neji's eyes for a moment. I didn't do it for you. Neji blinked. I visited your cousin in the hospital after you nearly killed her, Naruto said. I saw her every day, and she never mentioned seeing a single member of her family when she was there. She really only asked for one thing from me when I visited her. Do you know what that was? Neji slowly shook his head. Your life, Naruto snapped. She practically begged me not to kill you. She knew I wanted to. I still want to. Either that or claw a little lower, rip out your eyes, and leave you forever blinded. She was coughing up blood at one point, but she wouldn't stop talking, wouldn't stop making excuses for you and what you did. Naruto looked down and saw that his hands were trembling. He took a deep breath and blew it out. I couldn't tell her no. So you had to live. But I asked my teacher if I could damage a seal using chakra in a special way and he explained how it could be done. Naruto smiled a little, but it never reached his eyes. I don't think that was quite what he had in mind, but it seems to have worked. So this was just an experiment, Neji concluded in a flat voice. No, Naruto corrected. You're right. You owe a debt for being freed from the seal. But you don't owe it to me, you owe it to Hinata. I did it for her. She hates that seal even more than you do. Neji opened his mouth to protest, but Naruto interrupted him. He'd had a lot of time to practice what he wanted to say, and he wasn't about to let Neji interrupt him now. She feels guilty and ashamed every time she thinks about the seals on you and the other branch family members. She'd rather be in the branch family herself and carry the seal than be in the main family and feel responsible for the others being sealed. And even aside from that, despite all the crap you helped her father put her through, despite all the special training sessions, despite you almost goddamn killing her for a stupid examination bout, she still thinks of you as Neji ni-san, her cousin. Naruto shook his head. Did you know her earliest memory is wishing she could trade places with you? She envied the fact that everyone said your father actually liked you before he died, while hers, well, I guess he liked you better as well, as long as he had a seal on you, right? Neji leaned back on his stool and Naruto abruptly realized that he was leaning far forward. He took a deep breath as he straightened. Does that sound like a weak person to you, Neji? Naruto shook his head. As far as I'm concerned, any debt you owe me is really owed to her. Make up with Hiyoshibaka if you have to, convince him you'll remain loyal, but look out for her when I can't. Act like her cousin and not just another fucked up Hyuga idiot. You want to discharge your debt. Well, Hinata wants her cousin back. Give her that and your honor is satisfied. Got it. Neji nodded and slowly got up from his stool. He turned to leave, paused, and then bowed very low to Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto was silent as he watched the Hyuga leave. Chapter 20 Hinata stepped as lightly as possible as she approached the main family quarters. Odd how she didn't really think of it as home anymore. Staying at Kurenai-sensei's house, she'd felt more welcome there than she'd ever felt in the Hyuga compound. At least since her mother died. Things had been, at least a little different then, but that had been so long ago that it was becoming hard to remember. These days, she had little wish to be here, not to mention the risk of encountering her father. Unfortunately, she'd been instructed to prepare for an extended journey and some of the gear she would need was still in her old room. There wasn't time to purchase new supplies, even if she did have the Ryu to waste. She just had to hope she could avoid her father and any inconvenient questions he might want answered. As she neared her objective, a panel abruptly slid aside. It took all of her willpower not to flinch away. Showing fear to her father would only make things worse. But it wasn't Hyuga Hiyoshi behind the rice paper panel. Neji ni-san, she blurted out. Against her will, her eyes were drawn toward the bandages on her cousin's forehead. She had little doubt he would find a way to make her pay for her teammates' actions, no matter what anyone said. Hinata-sama, he said in a perfectly controlled voice. His eyes seemed to pierce right through her, reminding her uncomfortably of her father. When he said nothing more, Hinata stepped forward to continue on toward her room. But she froze when Neji spoke again. 3 meters past me and you will fall within range of Hiyoshi-sama's Byakugan, he said. I believe he has several questions he wishes to pose to you, especially considering this mission the Hokage has given you. Hinata stepped back again, not wanting to take any chances. She was surprised that Neji could track the range of father's vision that closely. It implied that he could see almost as far with his Byakugan as the leader of the clan. Yet another realization that must have rankled, given his being born into the branch family. Neji's mouth twisted slightly. I take it you have been instructed not to speak of your mission. Hinata nodded. He would not doubt enjoy watching father make her squirm as he tried to make her talk. But this mission was also her chance to get away from Konoha and the Hyuga complex for an extended period of time. She could endure anything in the short term to make that dream a reality. I took the liberty of securing the shinobi equipment from your room, Neji continued, pulling Hinata's familiar backpack out from the room behind him. He gave it a small toss and Hinata caught it reflexively, too shocked to do anything else. Through the heavy fabric she could feel tent poles and the outline of her canteen. Thank you, Neji-ni-san, Hinata said after she gathered her wits. Thanks are not necessary, Neji replied coldly. It is, after all, the destiny of the branch family to serve the main family, is it not? Retrieving your gear for you is merely my duty. As you say, Neji-kun, Hinata murmured, too happy at the chance to avoid her father to care about his sarcastic tone. Sarcastic or not, his voice also didn't seem quite as cold as she was used to. She bowed deeply to her cousin, far deeper than a main family member had any business doing to a member of the branch family. Neji merely nodded, but his brows drew together just a fraction of an inch. That alone spoke volumes. Leave straight the way you came, he instructed. As Hinata turned to leave, he added, and tell Uzumaki that I will pay my debt. Naruto paced nervously near the western gate. The old pervert was supposed to meet them both there to begin their mission. He wasn't quite late yet, but he sure as hell wasn't early. Of course, Hinata-chan wasn't there either, but he knew she was going to have to try and sneak her gear out of the Hyuga compound, something he was more than a little worried about. He'd suggested she just forget about that stuff, they could share his tent after all. Right after he said that, Hinata turned bright red and Naruto wanted to smack himself in the face. He'd offered innocently enough, but he knew exactly how Jiraiya would take that. Best friends or not, a boy and a girl his age sharing the same two-man tent would garner some comments from him. Naruto shook himself out of his reverie. Just being around the Sannin a short while had him thinking about dirty stuff. Kurenai-sensei would be ashamed of him. Hinata deserved better too. He resumed pacing. Blaming the lecherous old fart was better than sitting around worrying about Hinata-chan. Her father was a major jerk and there was no telling what he might try to pull if he ran into her before they left town. Naruto wondered if going back for her traveling supplies was a way for Hinata to prove to herself that she wasn't really afraid of him. Maybe he'd ask Kurenai-sensei when they returned. Oi, where's your girlfriend? A loud voice asked from behind him. Naruto had to control himself to keep from jumping. Pervert or not, the Sannin was, in fact, a great ninja, and he'd been able to sneak up on Naruto while he was actively looking for both him and his teammate. It almost made up for his personal habits. Almost. Naruto clenched his fists as he spun around, but refrained from lashing out at the old jerk. That would just egg him on to do worse. Hinata had to pick up her gear from the Hyuga main house, he explained. She should be here any minute. A ghost of a frown skittered across the face beneath the horned forehead protector. Naruto wondered if Kurenai-sensei had told Jiraiya anything about Hinata's father. He opened his mouth to speak, then relaxed when he saw a flash of gray out of the corner of his eye. I am sorry to keep you waiting, Hinata said breathlessly as she ran up. She started to bow in apology, but Jiraiya carelessly waved it off. You're just on time, he said. You brats ready to go? Naruto and Hinata both nodded. Then say goodbye and we'll get started, Jiraiya said, nodding towards something behind them. They turned and Naruto saw Kurenai-sensei and Shino step out of the shadows of the guardhouse. She'd already bid them good luck on their mission, but Naruto was touched that she and Shino still wanted to see them off. After waving to Shino, Naruto and Hinata both bowed deeply to their sensei. She returned the bow. Then they were off. No words were needed. Their first destination was Atofika City, one of the larger cities within Fire Country. To Naruto's surprise, they simply set off down the road at a comfortable walk. It took less than 15 minutes for him to crack. Is there a reason we are traveling so slow? He finally asked. I mean, we want to find this person as quickly as possible, right? Jiraiya sighed. You ever see a cat try to catch a bird? Naruto nodded. Does that cat run around like its tail is on fire, looking for birds, or does it sneak up slowly? The Sannin asked sarcastically. Do you think Tsunade-sama will try to avoid us? Hinata asked curiously. Jiraiya shrugged. It's possible, he said, making a vague gesture with his hand. She can sense chakra usage from a ways off, and she tends to avoid shinobi these days, even ones that might be from Konoha. I thought you wanted my clones to help find her. Naruto asked, remembering the conversation in the Hokage's office. I will, after I ask her the first time and she turns me down. By the time, she'll already know we're in the area. I'd just like to get close before we have to start actively chasing her. Jiraiya grinned. She can still move pretty fast when she wants to. Great, Naruto groused. Then that means we can't practice while we're walking, can we? Jiraiya looked puzzled, so Hinata helpfully explained how Kurenai had them practice various minor jutsu as they traveled. Well, I suppose the runt here needs all the chakra control practice he can get, Jiraiya mused aloud, much to Naruto's annoyance, but now is not a good time. Consider it patience training, brat. You need more of that too. Naruto glared at the older man, but then realized Jiraiya was deliberately winding him up. With an effort, he turned away from the annoying old coot and spoke to Hinata in little more than a whisper, deliberately ignoring the Sannin. Hinata was just a little bit impressed. Naruto was normally so passionate that, well, it was easy for someone to provoke him. She had to suppress a smile when she saw the disappointed frown on the mission leader's face. So, any trouble getting your stuff? Her friend asked. Hinata swallowed. Things had been rather tense at the Hyuga compound, but Neji's actions were even more unnerving. I didn't see father, but Naruto just raised an eyebrow, something he'd picked up from Shino at one point. He only did it around his teammates and she originally thought he'd done it deliberately to tease Shino, but now she wasn't sure. When they talked in the hospital, he used it to great effect every time her words jammed up in her throat. Just thinking about that conversation again made her a little lightheaded, and for a moment, she had to concentrate on where she placed her feet. I talked to Neji, she whispered as the silence stretched out. He was different, at least a little. He intercepted me right before I would have encountered father and gave me my pack. He was still very cold, but not as angry as usual. I don't really understand. Well, he doesn't have that seal on him anymore, Naruto ventured. Maybe that changed him. Hinata stared at her teammate. She knew Neji's seal had been damaged during their match, but after the elders had convened, she'd heard no more about it. Were they unable to repair it? More importantly, how did Naruto know? How did you know about that? She asked hesitantly. Naruto grimaced, scratching at the back of his head like he'd been caught doing something. Well, you didn't want me to kill him, or cripple him, so I figured I'd see if I could pull that stick out of his butt. He blinked and grimaced. Hinata stared at her best friend as he muttered about unfortunate metaphors, and looked faintly embarrassed. Elsewhere, Kurenai, Asuma, and Kakashi had finally met up to discuss their bets. Actually, it was more like Kurenai cornered the two Jonin. There was a slight dispute regarding the exact terms of their wager. Since the third part of the Chunin examination had not been concluded, there was some precedent for saying that all bets were off. On the other hand, the words, "will get farther than yours," had been used, at least casually, with respect to their genin. By that measure, Team 8 had, with Naruto's and Shino's victories, at least made it to the second round of the finals. Of course, the final decision regarding promotions was not dependent on the results of the matches. A careful, thoughtful candidate eliminated in the first round by a more powerful opponent might be selected for promotion, while the powerful, but rash fighter might be passed over. Chunin were generally stronger than genin, but it was their leadership qualities that made the final grade. Shikamaru, Asuma argued, only forfeited his fight because he realized something was wrong, and anticipated the betrayal and invasion. That was something Kurenai's students couldn't claim. If he'd stayed and fought in a complete tournament, it was entirely possible that he'd have found a way to overcome both Naruto and Shino as well. Kakashi didn't really have much of an argument, none of his students had even made the final round. He was attending more as a referee and because he hoped he might find a way to avoid giving up his little orange books for 2 months. In time, however, the wrangling of his colleagues began to get a little boring, right up until he noticed 2 cloaked figures drifting through the street traffic. Bored out of his mind, Naruto tried to invent new ways to amuse himself. He couldn't really train or do anything involving chakra at the moment. He didn't know if the old pervert was serious or not, but he didn't want to be responsible for failing the mission if he was. He also couldn't really do much physical training while they were traveling. This Tsunade person could move pretty fast if she decided to avoid them, at least that's what Ero Sennin claimed, anyway. That meant he couldn't really afford to get tired out, either. That left mental training, but he couldn't exactly pull out a scroll while they were walking. Not on a mission. Maybe he could work on his observational skills, he thought after a while. Of course, the scenery was much the same, at least until they got farther away from Konoha. Eventually, he settled on trying to make covert observations of his companions as well as other travelers. The old pervert was pretty oblivious, but Hinata always seemed to fidget a bit when she knew he was looking at her. As observant as she was, watching her without her noticing was quite a challenge. At first, just watching her out of the corner of his eye and not stumbling in the road was challenging enough. He supposed being able to focus like that might prove useful if he ever had to tail someone in a crowd. With a little practice, Naruto got good enough at observing that he could actually pay attention to what he was seeing. Hinata seemed different. She didn't duck her head down as much as she used to. It wasn't a big difference, but he'd noticed in the past when they sparred she would have to straighten her neck from her normal posture when she slid into her Juken stance. Now she seemed to look straight ahead. He supposed it didn't make much difference which way she faced since she had the Byakugan, but it was more subtle than that. Kurenai had lectured them a couple of times regarding body language and how to interpret it. This was one of those subjects that Hinata was far more adept at than her teammates. Of course, she tried to hide that at first, at least until Shino had asked her point blank if she'd been trained in this subject by her clan. It was only then that she revealed exactly how much farther ahead she was than her teammates. She'd seemed almost embarrassed, at least at first, until Naruto and Shino had let her know, in their own ways, that they didn't mind at all. At least Naruto had stopped himself right before he asked her what her own mannerisms meant. But he supposed it was probably a good thing that she wasn't looking down quite so much. She'd been kind of worse in that respect after she fought Neji and ended up in the hospital, but ever since the invasion, when she'd subdued Tamari. Maybe she was a little more confident. After all, the sand girl she defeated had smacked Tenten around pretty good. That had to mean something, even if it had been a bad matchup for the weapon expert. Hinata's gait also seemed a little looser, more relaxed. Her whole body seemed to be that way, not that he was ogling her or anything. Maybe it was because she was finally over the lung damage that had hospitalized her for so long. Maybe it was because she was happy to be on another long mission again. He and Shino both noticed how much happier she'd been on the border patrol mission. He felt his jaw clench again when he thought about why he needed to do something nice for the Hokage and Kurenai-sensei when he got back to Konoha. For someone who'd been accused, with some justice, of living in the past, Hitaki Kakashi was still surprised by how the passage of time could change your perspective. He still remembered the last great shinobi war. He could remember the battles, the foes he'd killed and the friends he'd lost. But time had a way of passing, of wearing smooth the edges of the hardest memory, until you could recall the facts, but not how it felt. Years of being one of Konoha's elite jonin, feared by many, featured in countless bingo books, had robbed him of some of the worst recollections. Like the sensation of what it was like to face an enemy that outclassed you almost as easily as you outclassed your genin pupils. He'd gone back and forth with Uchiha Itachi while Asuma held off his partner, Hoshigaki Kisame, with his trench knives. Kurenai tried to ensnare them both in a genjutsu. 3-on-2 seemed like pretty good odds, except Asuma could barely block the massive blade wielded by the Shark Man. Kurenai's illusions were almost instantly countered by the renegade Uchiha's Sharingan eyes, and Kakashi, well, he had the distinct feeling the Uchiha was merely playing with him, curious to see what his transplanted Sharingan eye was capable of. Every trick, every stratagem Kakashi tried was countered almost as soon as it was begun, and with far more ease than he was able to stop Itachi's attacks. Kakashi grabbed Kurenai after Itachi reversed her own demonic tree bind back on her. He got her clear of Itachi's kunai as quickly as he could, but he was fairly certain the Uchiha had time to stab her if he'd wanted to. From the thoughtful frown on Kurenai's face, she'd come to a similar conclusion. So rather than press the counter-attack, Kakashi held back for a moment, assessing his foe while keeping his gaze focused away from Itachi's eyes. Even without making himself vulnerable to hypnosis, he could still read the Nukenin's body language with his peripheral vision. You have a lot of nerve coming back here, Itachi, Kakashi said in a low voice. What could possibly make you want to return to Konoha now? He paused and smiled a little under his mask. Homesick. If anything, Itachi took himself even more seriously than Sasuke. Kurenai. I have been given a task, Itachi said as the tomo around his pupils began to spin. A task which I shall complete. Don't look at his eyes, Kakashi barked to his comrades, leaving only his one Sharingan eye open now. Only someone with a Sharingan can face him now. Itachi smiled faintly. Kakashi swallowed. You're after Sasuke? He asked. It made sense, of a twisted sort, given the last words he spoke to his brother. No, Itachi said slowly. We are here for the key to the Fourth's legacy. He blurred forward, faster than Kakashi could even see clearly, and buried his fist in the pit of Kurenai's stomach. Even as Kakashi spun towards her, she gasped and her eyes flew open reflexively. Kurenai's red eyes met Itachi's Sharingan. And she was lost. Kurenai found herself in an odd place, tied to a pole like a criminal about to be executed. Something was wrong with her eyes, and then she realized the light that was wrong. Everything around her, including the parts of her own body that she could see, was shaded like a photonegative. Itachi appeared in front of her, shaded the same way. This dojutsu is the ultimate expression of the art of genjutsu. This is the world of Tsukiyomi, a world where space, time, and substance are all controlled by me. From now on, you will endure 72 hours of torture. The suffering of your soul will be real. Your spirit will not understand that this is not reality. Some never recover from the experience, and even the strongest will be incapacitated for some time. Long enough for my purposes. Purposes? Kurenai asked reluctantly. No matter how hard she concentrated, she couldn't feel the underlying chakra of this illusion. She'd already bitten her lip, but even foreign pain couldn't shift this perceived reality. I will make you face your worst fears, repeatedly, for 72 hours, rendering you insensate at best, and permanently impaired at worst. Itachi informed her. Either way, you will serve as bait and a bargaining chip with your student. Even if his current protector forbids it, he will offer himself up in exchange for you. Kurenai tensed and opened her mouth, but even as she began to curse, time seemed to slow down until her words were distorted and meaningless. This is the part where you make some tedious statement of defiance. I shall instead begin the torture now. He paused and blinked. If you retain your sanity afterward, I will be curious as to what you think of the ultimate genjutsu of the Sharingan. The world dissolved and all awareness of Kurenai's body was swept away. She abruptly found herself pilloried in the large square in front of the Hokage's tower. Also tied to the posts were her students. Surrounding them was a large crowd of faceless people. Despite their lack of features, they still shared common traits, the primary one being a palpable sense of hatred. This was a lynch mob. Looking up at the balcony near the Hokage's office, Kurenai felt her stomach twist as she saw a tall faceless man in the Hokage's robes of office. The faceless Hokage made an angry gesture and the crowd surged forward. Naruto was the first to feel their wrath, fingers tearing at his face, gouging out his eyes before hands with knives could stab into his torso. He screamed in agony far longer than Kurenai would have believed possible, until he went limp in a pitiful gust of red chakra, shaded dark by the odd light. Hinata was crying and screaming as she watched Naruto die in front of her, and the crowd turned on her next. Her voice rose in shrill arpeggios as they tore at her body, until it finally trailed off in a gurgle. Shino was silent until close to the end, when he gave out a single strangled yell. Kurenai was almost numb when the hands came for her. And then she was back in the square again. She shook her head, wondering for a moment why her hair was back on her scalp and free of blood. She looked out over the crowd, blinking rapidly as they surged forward again. Only a single figure near the edge had a face. Itachi. This time they started with Shino, and then her as Naruto and Hinata screamed their names as they died. By the time the scene reset again, Kurenai was already beginning to go numb with horror. The Tsukiyomi was feeding on her fears of what might happen to her students if everything went wrong. If an unfriendly, unjust Hokage came to power, they might well be made scapegoats to appease certain factions in the village. It had happened in other lands. And the so-called ultimate genjutsu was working. She wasn't sure how many repetitions of this scene she could endure before her mind shut down, at least temporarily, to protect itself. 72 continuous hours of this horror would break her. As she braced herself for the next round of screaming, Kurenai racked her brain for some way of countering the arrogant Uchiha's dojutsu. She remembered Kobaru-sensei's introduction to the subject of genjutsu, and how he told her privately that he thought she had the mental discipline and imagination to specialize in that area. Not that it was doing her much good now as the crowd ripped at her with frenzied hands. Imagination. She remembered Kobaru's lectures on breaking genjutsu and on how to beat them. They weren't the same thing. Beating a genjutsu means working with it, through it, or despite it to achieve your objectives, even if you couldn't directly break it. He liked to use physical metaphors for complex subjects, and he once compared genjutsu to mental wrestling. Sometimes the only way to break a hold was to move with it, instead of against it. As her ravaged body fell from the post to hit the ground in a spatter of blood and other fluids, the scene reset again. This time Kurenai didn't even try to disbelieve it. Instead, she channeled every morbid thought she'd ever had into making this scene real. This really could happen, she convinced herself, and felt her psyche sink deeper into the genjutsu. Her eyes focused on Naruto as the crowd tore Shino from his post, ribs snapping before the ropes broke. The blonde shinobi struggled to free his arms as the faceless villagers threw the bug user to the ground, stomping and kicking at him. Shino reached one hand toward Naruto, two broken fingers twisted obscenely, as his colonies drowned in his own blood. Kurenai barely felt it as the crowd tore her to pieces. Her own viewpoint seemed to separate from her tattered corpse as it focused on Naruto's face. Tears poured from his eyes as he screamed and cursed as he watched his team die. And then they went for Hinata. Kurenai's attention was focused to a razor's edge as they attacked the young Hyuga she loved like a daughter. Her own imagination supplied new tortures for the Tsukiyomi to inflict on the innocent young girl. But her eyes stayed focused on Naruto's face as he watched Hinata beaten, tortured, raped. And when he snapped, as she knew he would, she pushed with all of her will and forced the genjutsu to follow its own internal rules and make Naruto react, realistically. Naruto's eyes turned to slitted pupils as he threw his head back and roared. Chakra blasted out in every direction, obliterating the posts and tearing the faceless crowd to pieces. The Itachi observing this didn't even have time to react before he was reduced to a smear on the wall of the Hokage's tower. Chakra gathered back around the screaming Naruto as the Kyuubi's jailer retired and set his prisoner free. Flesh flowed like wet clay as the boy's body was remade in the Kyuubi's image. The faceless Hokage signaled for his Anbu to attack, and began the seals for a jutsu, right before a massive tail removed the top 3 floors of the tower. The Kyuubi reborn roared his defiance to the heavens. The only sign that Uzumaki Naruto had ever existed was a slight pause as the fox stopped and sniffed at the body of a young girl that lay cooling near one gargantuan forepaw. Then the 9-tailed fox quite deliberately stepped over the body as it engaged the arriving Anbu. Kurenai felt like she'd be somewhat sick to her stomach, if she knew where hers was. But mixed in with that was a strong sense of vindication. If this ever came to pass, well, Konoha would get what it deserved. If the will of fire ever descended to murdering the innocent as scapegoats, then it deserved to be extinguished. There would be justice. With that sense of elation, Yuhi Kurenai shattered the Tsukiyomi like a soap bubble. Kakashi was still turning toward Kurenai and Itachi when the Uchiha flinched back like he'd been struck. He raised one arm as if to shield himself from a blow before he shook his head. Kurenai had her arms around her middle where she'd been punched. But she was slowly straightening as she stepped back. And there was a smile on her face. Kisame landed next to Asuma and the Jonin barely got his knives up in time to block the shark man's chakra-eating sword, Samahata. Itachi, what the hell just happened? The Uchiha threw the shuriken in his left hand toward Kakashi. With only one eye open, he had to dodge a little wider than he normally would. During that split second, Itachi palmed a kunai and hurled it toward Kurenai, who was still straightening as she blinked away the aftereffects of whatever Itachi had done. No time for a jutsu. Kakashi tried to throw his own kunai to deflect it, but the angle was wrong and he'd had to have thrown his blade 3 times faster than Itachi to make a difference. With a heavy thump, the Uchiha's kunai buried itself up to the handle in Kurenai's forehead. Naruto eyed the hotel Jiraiya had selected with some distaste. It wasn't exactly located in a nice section of town. On the other hand, he was tired from their plodding journey and Ero Sennin was paying the bill. He'd even splurged on 2 rooms, so Hinata could have some privacy. It was almost respectable of him. Of course, those thoughts evaporated when the old pervert declared he needed to do some solo reconnaissance. He might have been a little more convincing if he hadn't had his tongue hanging out of his mouth as he left. Still, he wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. He and Hinata had been walking most of the day, with their weights on. It was surprising how tiring it was to travel so slowly, not using chakra at all. After a hot bath, it felt good to lie down for a while and take a nap. But his dreams were troubled as he slept, filled with a nameless sense of dread. What the hell, Itachi? Kisame demanded, ignoring Asuma's trench knife sticking out of his shoulder. This wasn't in the plan. The plan has been changed, Itachi rasped, dodging Kakashi's next kunai as quickly as it was thrown. She proved far more skillful than I had reason to believe. She is too dangerous to keep alive, even as a hostage. I don't even know why we bothered in the first place, the shark man growled as he missed the bearded Jonin with Samahata on the backswing. These Konoha wimps were finally getting serious after Itachi killed their friend. What a waste. The target has training at evasive tactics, Itachi replied in a bored tone. It bugged Kisame how little his partner seemed to care. Given his capabilities and who he was seen leaving with, it was logical to seek leverage. Well, what does your logic say we should do now? Kisame demanded. It was merely a matter of time before enough of Konoha's Anbu showed up with enough numbers to make things difficult. We meet at the 3rd location, Itachi replied, dropping an armed explosive tag from the wide sleeve of his cloak. It detonated even as it touched the water, sending spray dozens of feet up into the air. Before the air had cleared, the red and black cloaked figures were gone. Naruto and Hinata, minus their Hittite and in clothes that could pass for civilian wear, slowly made their way through the festival quarter. Atafaka City seemed to thrive on tourism. From the posters they could see, every possible minor occasion had its own festival and some of the vendor booths looked more permanent than the houses. Naruto had been discouraged from participating in many of Konoha's yearly celebrations, so he was content to follow Hinata's lead. A few subtle changes to her gait, facial expressions, and mannerisms transformed stiff Hyuga formality into the behavior of a merchant's daughter. Before they left the hotel, Hinata had Naruto leave his jacket behind and purchase a bright red t-shirt that did not clash with his pants as badly as he anticipated. She also encouraged him to smile as much as possible after she used small amounts of makeup to conceal the whisker marks on his cheeks. Naruto thought she was maybe going a little overboard, but any comments died a warning as she delicately smoothed foundation across his cheeks with her fingertips. She evidently found this just as awkward as he did, because she was blushing as well. On the other hand, Naruto knew there was zero chance of him applying anything to his own face without it being obvious. So he kept quiet. Still, it was almost a relief when she was done and he could relax, being careful not to move his face too much before the traces of makeup finished drying. He watched, fascinated, as Hinata took a small case from a pouch on her backpack and carefully slid tinted circles of some soft material onto her eyes. After a couple of blinks to align them, his friend had blue eyes to go with her fair complexion. Without her own jacket to hide in, Hinata's body looked different as well. Naruto realized that because it was slightly oversized, the jacket tended to make his friend look smaller, meeker, and younger than she really was. Able to see her arms for once, he noticed that their training regimen had definitely had an effect. If Hinata wanted to disguise herself as the hardworking daughter of peasant farmers, she had the shoulders and forearms to carry that off as well. They'd been gone 5 minutes, with Hinata growing increasingly edgy, before Naruto realized he'd been glancing sidelong at his friend the whole time. He awkwardly complimented her acting skills and she relaxed a little. They threaded through the booths, slowly winding their way through the festival grounds, heading toward the more adult areas of the tourist district. From what Jiraiya-sensei had told them of his former teammate, Hinata figured that they would be more likely to find her in such areas, especially those with gambling. It was a little hard to imagine a Sannin, retiring, to become little more than a traveling gambler, but Hinata could tell there was a lot their mission leader was leaving out of his story. Shinobi of their skills didn't just leave a village without being labeled missing ninja, not unless there were truly unique circumstances. From the way Jiraiya-sensei acted, Hinata suspected that his departure was more of a long-term mission than a true retirement. There was no awkwardness as he took command, no unfamiliarity of protocol. He was still on active duty, reporting directly to the Hokage. She was sure of it. Hinata jerked out of her reverie when Naruto took her hand. The crowds they were weaving through were tighter, the people bigger and older on average. He was only acting like a boy his age might when accompanying his sister or friend in such surroundings. That was the only reason. It had to be. But that didn't stop her lips from forming a small smile. Naruto tensed up as they began to move through the more adult sections of Otafuku's festival quarter. There were a lot of those kinds of places, a lot more than in Konoha, and he wondered again what kind of Hokage hung out in places like this. He also noticed some of the men there were looking at Hinata, the same way they looked at the other women. He took his teammate's hand to make it clear that she wasn't there by herself, but he wasn't sure all of them got the message. Mission or not, the first person to try anything was going to get seriously hurt. This covert operation stuff was harder than he thought. Once upon a time, Kakashi being late for a team meeting was pretty much par for the course. But after Team 7 was so easily eliminated during the Chunin exam by their former classmates, that had all changed. Sasuke had challenged their sensei to train them as hard as they could endure and his teammates had backed him on that. Wounded pride wasn't the best of motivations, but neither Kiba nor Sakura enjoyed the thought of being left behind. The fact that they were all struggling as hard as they could to keep up with the new regimen seemed to improve their teamwork as well. It probably helped that Sakura was usually too tired to even talk to Sasuke at the end of the day. The events of the Chunin exam seemed to shake up their sensei as well. Sakura didn't think she'd seen a single orange book cover since then, and he was always on time for training sessions. So when sensei was late this afternoon, the pink-haired Kunoichi was concerned. Then she heard a strange bird call, and suddenly leaping figures appeared, darting across the rooftops. She glanced over at her teammates. Sasuke was sitting quietly, but his eyes had popped open the moment she heard the bird call. Kiba had been fidgeting for the last several minutes. He couldn't really stand to sit still. Let's go, she said. What? Kiba asked, clearly confused. Sensei is late for the first time in weeks, and I think they just called an Anbu mobilization, Sakura explained as she stood up. She's right, Sasuke added quietly. His simple agreement might have made her heart race once, but Sakura was still annoyed with her teammate. Bad enough that he didn't think she could kill a simple snake, but what he'd said about Hinata to Naruto was uncalled for. Even if it was a valid tactic, he had insulted someone who defended him while he was helpless from the curse seal. Sakura was secretly glad that Naruto had punched him for it, just maybe not quite so hard. The dog user picked up Akamaru and Team 7 set off in the general direction the Anbu had gone. Sakura remembered Naruto's words she'd overheard. Sakura isn't as nice as she seems. She only likes one person and she doesn't really give a damn about anyone else. It was nearly as hard as Sensei's new training, but Sakura was determined to become a better person. Sasuke couldn't fault Sakura's reasoning, even if she was barely talking to him. A 9-block area near one of the canals was completely locked down to non-Anbu personnel, but Kiba picked up their sensei's scent trail leaving the area, mixed in with a lot of blood that wasn't his. That trail led them to the hospital, where the simpering young woman at the front desk refused to give any details. At least, she refused to give any information to Sakura, but when Sasuke quietly asked her for information regarding the location of his Jonin sensei, she blushed, stammered, and finally directed them to the basement level. It took no small effort to keep his face from twisting in disgust. For one thing, the woman was easily twice his age. For another, it always annoyed him how people made exceptions for him because he was an Uchiha. He wanted recognition just like anyone, he supposed, but he wanted it for things he'd actually done, not just because of the family he'd been born into or the eyes he inherited. Yes, the Sharingan were powerful, but he hadn't done much with his yet. People throwing themselves at his feet for no reason was just wrong, and he found he had little respect for most of Konoha. He had nearly killed the first civilian that tried to console him about his loss to Naruto, explaining how his clan had tried to get the results overturned by the Hokage. Like that would mean anything, a victory given to him on a silver platter because he wasn't good enough to earn it himself. The idiot had thought Sasuke had drawn his kunai at the mention of Naruto's name. If anything, he owed the blonde-haired idiot for the lesson he taught. He'd been coasting too long at the academy, assuming he'd be ready for Itachi when the time came. Naruto put paid to that little fantasy. Some quiet observation and a few questions revealed just how hard the dead last of his academy class had been training since they graduated. Rock Lee was another genin that should never have graduated at all, yet he had trained himself in taijutsu to the degree that most chunin didn't really want, just a friendly spar, with the fuzzy eyebrow weirdo. And he was Naruto's regular sparring partner. At least now Sasuke felt like he was making progress. As they rode the elevator down, Sasuke glanced over at Sakura, who was looking increasingly apprehensive. She looked over at him. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "My aunt used to work at this hospital," Sakura replied. "There aren't any treatment areas on the basement level." "What is down here?" Kiba asked in a hushed voice. From the expression on his face, as well as Akamaru's, the smells associated with the hospital must be overwhelming. "The morgue." Sasuke didn't react, aside from a small tick under his left eye. But when the door opened, they walked very quietly down the hallway. Voices were coming from the corridor junction up ahead, voices they recognized. "How did you know?" they heard Kakashi-sensei ask in a tired voice. "One of my allies was staying with her," they heard Shino say. When the event occurred, it followed instructions to return to the hive and report. Edging a little farther along the corridor, Sasuke could see Kakashi now, facing away from them, his body bent with fatigue. He had not seen his sensei so drained since the mission in Wave Country when he collapsed from chakra exhaustion after fighting Zabuza. His voice was even more ragged. "I think he was trying to capture her. He used some special genjutsu technique from his Sharingan, and she was able to counter it. But it left her off balance long enough to." Shino nodded once. If she had developed a counter for his technique, he would not want her to share that information with others. It was logical that she be killed. The Ibarame's voice was flat, but it still put chills down Sasuke's spine. Then the rest of it sank in. "His Sharingan. Itachi, I need to report to the Hokage," Kakashi continued, pushing away from the wall. "I wanted to warn you. He's after Naruto. That's why he tried to capture Kurenai. He might try to use you next." Kakashi didn't seem aware of his student's presence, but it was more of a miracle that he could even stand, let alone stagger down the hallway. He didn't even seem to hear the muffled gasp from Sakura when he said Kurenai's name. That's how badly the copy ninja was out of it. It took all of Sasuke's self-control not to move, not to breathe, until Kakashi was gone. Then he shot forward and grabbed Shino's arm. In a flash, the air around them was thick with flying insects, each of them buzzing with rage, but Sasuke ignored them. "Do you have a tag on Naruto?" he hissed. "And what if I do, Uchiha?" Shino asked, his voice even colder than before. It occurred to Sasuke that it was possible the bug user might decide to extract vengeance on himself as the closer target, rather than waiting to find Itachi. And he was already in the middle of the Ibarame swarm. "We need to warn Naruto," he said quickly. "He's out of town on a mission. I'm sure the Hokage will," Shino began, but Sasuke cut him off. "Wherever he is, do you think anyone can find him faster than you?" Sasuke asked. Perhaps not," Shino said. Then his brows drew down. Why is this your concern? He asked pointedly. Sasuke started to snap back, then paused. He sighed. Itachi was an Uchiha. It's my responsibility to stop him, or at least keep him from hurting anyone else if I can. Shino's eyes seemed to bore into him through the dark glasses. I can agree, but only to the extent that my teammate's safety is a higher priority than your vengeance. Then let's go, Sasuke agreed. Not without us, Kiba interjected, stepping forward. Sakura was half a step behind him. Sasuke shook his head. You can't leave the village outside of a mission without parental or clan permission. Then how can? Kiba started to ask and then cut himself off. How can Shino go? My allies are already conveying a message to my father, Shino supplied smoothly. Sasuke wondered if it was really that fast or if the Aburame was lying through his collar. Sasuke, Sakura began, Kakashi-sensei he will remember that we don't currently have any missions scheduled, Sasuke cut in. The only assignment we had was to meet for training and he didn't show up. Sakura frowned, but didn't say anything. They both knew that it was a technicality, even if it was true. But there was no way he'd miss out on a chance to frustrate his brother's plans. I'll mark the trees as we go, like Kakashi showed us, Sasuke offered. Meet up and follow as soon as you have clearance, he couldn't help but add. He had resented being ordered to shepherd civilians when others were fighting off the invaders, and been lectured about the importance of following orders and doing his duty. Well, now he was doing his duty as acting head of a one-man clan and it was their turn to follow standing orders. If that made him a little petty, then so be it. It took a while before Naruto or Hinata saw a familiar face. Unfortunately, it wasn't the pig-tailed blonde with the buxom figure that Jiraiya had described. Naruto was rather disgusted to see their so-called mission leader living it up. He had an attractive brunette hostess hanging all over him, and the old pervert was grinning like a white-haired baboon. Naruto turned to Hinata, scowling. She was blushing a little, so no use hoping she hadn't seen it already. Perhaps, Jiraiya-sama is interrogating a source, she asked hesitantly. Maybe, Naruto said, swallowing. He was glad Hinata was leaving him and out. She always tried to do that, going out of her way to avoid embarrassing anyone. It wasn't like Naruto was responsible for Jiraiya's behavior, but he felt profoundly embarrassed on behalf of the entire male gender. What kind of shinobi took time in the middle of an important mission for that? At least it was late enough to justify heading back to the hotel. The naive young villagers they were posing as were starting to stand out a little, and it would only get worse as the night wore on. After a whispered conversation, the two of them began working their way back to the festival grounds and to their hotel. No telling when Jiraiya would turn up. To tell the truth, Uchiha Sasuke was at least somewhat self-aware. He knew the reputation he'd developed as a brooding loner at the Konoha Ninja Academy. It wasn't something he'd purposefully cultivated, but he'd have to be an idiot to maintain no idea of how others saw him. Privately, it still boggled his mind how so many of his female contemporaries became completely irrational where he was concerned. For the most part, he was satisfied with the results. He didn't want the meaningless sympathy of strangers, and a cold exterior kept them at a comfortable distance where they belonged. The lasting effects of the genjutsu his brother tortured him with instead became useful habits for minimizing useless attachments. But now, he traveled with someone even less talkative. And, if it was possible, even angrier. Aburame Shino didn't say a single thing after they left the morgue and slipped out of the village. The fact that they went over the wall instead of using the gate confirmed his suspicions about whether Shino had formal permission yet. Not really his problem though. Not like Itachi. As they took to the trees, Sasuke was a little surprised at the pace Shino set. Aburame were known for their jutsu, not for their speed, but he was actually having to push a little to keep up. He didn't remember Shino being this fast when they were classmates. Had he been holding back, or was everyone getting stronger like Naruto? Sasuke tightened his jaw, scowling. Naruto and Hinata were both silent as they slipped into their hotel. Between her natural reticence and Naruto's embarrassment over the old pervert's behavior, no one really felt like talking. Naruto almost regretted talking the Hokage into sending Hinata along, right until he remembered the look on her face when she was going to be sent back to her family. There were worse things than the old pervert's amusements. It was child's play getting to their rooms unobserved. Light as it was, Naruto was still relieved to scrub the makeup off his face. From the way she was blinking, Hinata probably felt the same way about the blue contacts. After removing their disguises, they were about to head down for a late dinner when a knock came at their door. Naruto supposed the lecherous old goat struck out with the hostess if he was back so early. He flung open the door, ready to give Jiraiya a piece of his mind, but it wasn't his erstwhile tutor. Instead, it was an older version of Sasuke, wearing a black cloak with red clouds. He also wore a Konoha Hittite with a slash through the symbol. Naruto felt his stomach turn to ice. Itachi, Sasuke's older brother, the one that killed off the rest of the clan, including his own parents. He quickly averted his eyes. He knew from Kurenai-sensei's lecture on dojutsu that a fully evolved Sharingan can do things to anyone foolish enough to look into them. Hello, Naruto-kun. We would like you to come with us, the man said in a quiet, even voice. Behind him, Naruto could see a hulking figure in another robe. There was something wrong with the second one's face. His skin seemed to be tinged blue. Hinata sucked in a shocked breath, and Naruto felt like kicking himself for not letting her check the hallway before he opened the door. If you come along quietly, the Uchiha continued, no one else has to get hurt. You wouldn't want your friend to have an accident, would you? I still think we ought to take a leg off, the figure behind him growled. Keep him from trying to run off. Naruto was still in shock when he heard a cry of rage coming from the hallway behind the missing ninjas. Itachi spun with preternatural speed and caught a hurled kunai that was moving faster than Naruto could see. The blonde shinobi jerked back as a swarm of familiar-looking bugs descended on the blue-skinned killer. Itachi used the captured kunai to expertly deflect a hail of flaming shuriken. He almost looked bored. His partner swung a huge cloth-wrapped bundle through the swarm of Kikai bugs. In its wake, they either fell to the ground lifeless or veered drunkenly. The motion pushed back his cloak and hat. Naruto's stomach tensed. He looked like nothing more than a fish man with sharp teeth. Behind the shuriken came Sasuke with a kunai in each hand, moving faster than Naruto had ever seen him go, his eyes blazing red with spinning sharingans. He flew into some impossibly complex taijutsu combination, but his brother merely reached out and grabbed his ankle, a millisecond before his kick landed. Too slow, little brother, he gently chided, then swung Sasuke headfirst into the wall. There was a crash behind Naruto. Hinata had thrown the nightstand through the window. She grabbed his elbow and hauled backward as Itachi turned back toward them. Kill the Aburame, Itachi murmured. He is of no use to us. Send him off to meet his sensei. Naruto froze as the words sunk into his mind, nearly pulling Hinata off balance. It is foolish to resist the inevitable, Itachi continued. You will come with us. The only variable you control is how many more of your allies will die today. She looked pretty stupid with that kunai stuck in her head, the fish man added. With a wordless cry of rage and despair, Naruto's head snapped up. Before he realized what he was doing, his eyes met Itachi's Sharingan and he knew nothing more. Hinata was nearly weeping with frustration as she tried to get Naruto away from the missing nins. She'd heard enough about Uchiha Itachi to know they were no match for the S-classed mass murderer. She hoped Shino was just trying to provide them with a diversion, like one of their tactical exercises. Her stomach twisted when they announced Kurenai-sensei was dead. Worse, Naruto went completely rigid, and her task became impossible. She just wasn't strong enough to haul him bodily out the window if he resisted. That was her last thought before her vision filled with red chakra and she was thrown back against the bed. She painfully blinked away the tears that filled her eyes, her head already aching. And she was behind Naruto. In front of him, most of the doorway was gone, as was a good bit of the wall. In the hallway, she could see Shino staggering back, his swarm trailing after him. Itachi's partner had forgotten all about him, and was instead trying to swing a massive blunt sword horizontally at Naruto's side. As it plowed through his chakra flare, the bandages wrapping it burned away to reveal a mass of dull gray scales that glinted like teeth. Naruto's left hand shot out and the blade stopped 2 inches short of his palm. Red chakra sheathed his arm, and swirled around the sword that seemed to drink it in. Her Byakugan confirmed that the sword was indeed consuming the chakra, but it was being replaced just as fast, with no signs of it being diminished. But all that was forgotten as Naruto spoke in a voice that was not his own. Thank you ever so much, Itachi-kun. Your little genjutsu utterly ravaged the boy's will, allowing me to subvert the seal. Now I am in control, and the seal protects me from outside influences, like your filthy Sharingan. The voice was hollow, mocking, but with a feral undercurrent that made the hairs on her neck rise up. Naruto's free hand rose, and red chakra coalesced around it, forming claws of fire that grew longer even as she watched. Then a deep voice called out, Ninpu, Gamaguchi Shibari, and the walls, ceiling, and floor were covered with a thick fleshy material that was bright pink and smelled like rich earth and forests. Through the walls, she saw Jiraiya stride into view at the end of the hall, the woman he'd been flirting with earlier slung over his shoulder. It's really kind of insulting, he continued in a conversational tone. Did you really think you could distract me with something so obvious? It worked long enough, Itachi countered. Not long enough, Jiraiya snapped. Because now you both die. Food inside the gullet of Iwagama-san. The fish man growled as he jerked his foot free of the sticky material. The red-sheathed Naruto shoved his sword aside with a contemptuous flick, knocking the bulky man even more off balance. He growled and brought the sword back for another swing, but Itachi barked, "Kisame, come," and they both flashed toward the opposite end of the corridor. Hinata's eyes tracked them through the walls as they turned the corner. The stairwell was already blocked, and the pink masses were growing over the last window at the end. But there was a flash of black fire, chakra so intense it was nearly solid, and then they were gone, moving beyond her range so quickly they effectively disappeared. Jiraiya cautiously followed them, scowling as he turned the corner and saw they'd escaped. Damn it, they got away, he grumbled. Then he turned back to Naruto and froze. That's when Hinata realized that her best friend's eyes had turned completely red with slit pupils. "Ah, good, I still have a little time before the moron recovers," Naruto said in a darkly sardonic voice that was not his own. "Plenty of opportunity to deal with you and properly thank you for teaching that blonde idiot how to use seals." Hinata felt like she was watching someone else as her body stepped in front of what was clearly a Naruto possessed by his prisoner. She swallowed and said, "IW won't let you do that." Naruto's brows drew down into a scowl. "Don't think I won't hesitate to crush you like the insect you are. Step aside." For an instant, Hinata wanted nothing more than to do that. She ruthlessly pushed down her fear. "And Naruto-kun said I was his best friend. Do you think he'd let you live if you killed me?" She couldn't ever imagine saying something like that out loud, but it was the first thing that came to mind. The thing wearing Naruto's body looked her up and down in a way that made her very uncomfortable. "You have a lot of spine for someone so small, insect. Perhaps you'd make good breeding stock." Despite the terror that made her want to throw up, she still felt her face redden. Naruto's body shuddered. "Maybe you aren't as in control as you think you are," Jiraiya observed. Hinata didn't need her eyes to tell he was smirking at it. Him. Naruto. Damn it, without them here, this idiot's rage is fading. Now the seal wants to work properly. Naruto shook his head, clenching his fists. "Hypocritical thing. I'd love to take the time to rip your face off, you frustrated old virgin, but I need you to get this idiot somewhere safe." With that, Naruto's eyes faded back to their normal blue and white as they rolled back into his head and he crumpled to the floor. Hinata barely managed to catch him before he cracked his head open. "I'm getting too old for this shit," Jiraiya observed. Chapter 21. Hinata's fingers ached and it took her a moment to realize that her hands were tightly clenched as she stared down at her teammate's face. Naruto-kun was still unconscious from Itachi's attack, though he was resting peacefully now. But periodically his face would twist into an agonized expression like he was having a nightmare he couldn't wake from. At first, she and Shino had tried to wake him when this happened, thinking he was throwing off the effects. However, he could not be roused, even when Jiraiya-sama touched a forefinger glowing with chakra to Naruto's forehead. At that point, he frowned and Hinata felt her stomach drop. Their mission leader was wearing his all-business expression, when the playful facade he wore dropped away and she could see the Sanin behind it. "I think he's suffered some sort of mental trauma," he said thoughtfully, "and that's why he can't wake up. Fixing that sort of thing is beyond my skills." Hinata did not allow herself to gasp. She would not be weak now, not after Itachi used harming her as a threat to manipulate Naruto, along with the news of what he had done to Sensei. Just thinking about that for an instant made her gorge rise, so she ruthlessly suppressed it. Not on a mission. Not when she needed to be strong. Not when people depended on her. Who can repair such damage? Shino asked quietly, returning from where he'd laid out the unconscious Uchiha. Using the genin and some shadow clones, Jiraiya had moved them to another inn, undamaged and more secure, faster than Hinata would have believed possible. Coincidentally, our objective is one of, if not the, most highly skilled medic nin on the continent, Jiraiya replied. It's not directly in her specialty, but I'm pretty sure she could help. We just need to find her before she leaves town. Hinata spoke up. Then we must find her, and quickly. Jiraiya-sama, do we really have to stay with the stealthy approach now? Jiraiya shook his head. No, not after all the chakra released earlier. She'd have to be blind drunk not to notice it. She's either decided it doesn't involve her or she's halfway to Wave Country by now. Hinata had to steel herself not to flinch at the older man's words. They could not fail. Not now, not after everything. Jiraiya was all business now. He assigned Shino to guard the new room he'd rented, while Naruto rested fitfully and Sasuke slept off the beating he'd received. He also left behind a couple of shadow clones and seeded the area with summoned toads of various sizes to keep watch. For some reason he didn't leave any in the room with Shino. Just the two clones, one that monitored Sasuke's vital signs and another that kept watch out the window and periodically jotted down notes in a thick scroll opened on the table beside it. Hinata thought it was just her imagination, but Shino seemed oddly relieved for some reason. Within minutes, Hinata and Jiraiya had taken to the air, leaping from rooftop to rooftop as they crisscrossed Atofika City. Hinata kept her Byakugan active the whole time, ignoring the slow burning sensation that built up in her eye sockets as she compared every face she saw to the faded photograph Jiraiya had shown her. She refused to be weak, not after everything that happened, but her chakra reserves were running low when she got a glimpse of a blonde-haired woman's face at the very edge of her range. She stopped dead on her next landing, cutting back over 90 degrees to pursue the trace she'd seen. She almost thought she'd imagined it, when she found the woman again kneeling down to throw dice inside a gambling hall. Hinata's relief was palpable, but she was shamed at the way her knees buckled a little as she landed in front of the hall. She was mortified when Jiraiya had to steady her shoulder even as he asked what she'd seen. She merely nodded, unable to speak through her suddenly closed throat, and pointed toward the open doors of the gambling hall. But the white-haired man didn't sneer at her weakness. Instead, he grinned and gave her a nod of acknowledgement. Good job, kid. I know you're a little young for this kind of place, so stay close to me. With that, he threw open the swinging doors and strode in, bold as daybreak. Tsunade looked down at the dice in her hand and frowned. She'd started winning, just a little, earlier that afternoon. That wasn't so bad, and if anything might get Shizune off her back about the debts she was piling up. But now her dice were on fire. She didn't mind a little luck. Every gambler needed some. But not like this. She'd gone from winning every now and then, maybe coming out a little ahead, to winning steadily. And now it seemed like she couldn't lose, no matter what the odds. And that frightened her. Her luck was a fickle bitch. She could only remember a few times she'd been this lucky. She'd purchased winning tickets in 2 different lotteries on the same day. Another day had seen her draw a royal flush, cold, during a card game with her teammates as they waited for a mission assignment. The lottery results were announced the day her brother Nawaki left for his first, and last, mission. The poker game had been played with Dan and the rest of his team before the mission against Stone that ended his life. So, it was no wonder that a winning streak like this put Tsunade on edge. And brought up old memories, memories that could only be laid to rest with large amounts of sake. She wasn't roaring drunk, but she was definitely speaking louder than necessary drunk. Sake was also good for letting her put off thinking about Orochimaru's offer. Her old teammate looked like he'd seen better days, missing an arm and one lung somehow damaged by frostbite. He'd fed her some cock and bull story about a jutsu that backfired, but what she couldn't ignore was the carrot he offered. She wasn't sure if this jutsu he claimed to have developed would do all that it promised. But even getting to see them again for an instant would be worth it, even if it meant dealing with a traitor to the leaf. Besides, what had the leaf done for her but give her heartache and pain? She shook her head and prepared to roll again, but a familiar shade of red caught the corner of her eye. Damn, he was still wearing that ridiculous outfit. All she needed to make this day complete was a visit from her other annoying teammate. Ex-teammate, what do you want, Jiraiya? She asked in a flat tone as she stood up. No use trying to enjoy her scary run of luck now, not with him watching her and being all subtly disapproving. Like his habits were any better, the damn lecher, even if he claimed he still served Konoha. Her eyes narrowed as they picked out the small girl standing in his shadow. What the hell, Jiraiya? She asked. This isn't the kind of place for someone her age, she scolded. He shrugged in that way he'd developed that completely infuriated her. It acknowledged that he heard her, he just didn't care. No older than Shizune was when she left with you, he shot back. Nice to see you again, he added, nodding toward her assistant, who was holding Taunton, Nawaki's pet pig. You must be twice as tall as the last time I saw you. It's good to see you too, Jiraiya-sama, Shizune replied, in a far too respectful tone to Tsunade's ear. Was she getting old enough for his charm to work? Was she brainless enough as well? Well, that makes one of us that thinks so, Tsunade grated. What do you want? She demanded. Jiraiya managed to look hurt, but never lost his teasing grin. Is it too much to want to catch up with an old teammate? Relive the good old days. The old bastard was enjoying this, she realized. There were no good old days, she snapped, just a lot of meaningless death and bloodshed for nothing. The aftertaste of sake faded to ashes on her tongue. Jiraiya sighed in a tolerant fashion that made her want to hit him. I'll buy you a drink and we'll talk, all right. My treat. Her stomach stewed with resentment, but not enough to turn down a free drink. A few minutes later, they were in a booth at the bar next to the gambling hall. Shizune ordered some tempura, hoping as always that a little food would blunt the effects of sake. Tsunade couldn't really resent the girl's efforts to curb the worst of her excesses. Not after all she'd put up with in the past. Her assistant also got some tea for herself and Jiraiya's companion. Peering owlishly at the small girl, Tsunade finally noticed her eyes. A Hyuga, and with that unmarked forehead, she was of the main house. As quiet as she was, she must be seething with disapproval. Just like the rest of her stuck-up house. Something occurred to her that instantly put Tsunade on her guard. How many favors had Jiraiya used up in Konoha to secure the services of a main family Hyuga just to help locate her? Shizune valiantly tried to maintain civil conversation at the table as Tsunade glared at Jiraiya. Finally, as the first bottle was emptied, Tsunade spoke. All right, you didn't come all this way just to talk. What do you want? She asked bluntly. Jiraiya grimaced. He was always transparent to her, and it always seemed to catch him off guard when she saw through him. I wanted to ask a couple of favors, he admitted. She smirked. Here it comes. She raised a hand before he could continue. I'm not going back, she declared. I thought I made that clear years ago. That village has brought me nothing but pain. Look, Jiraiya said, hear me out. I know why you left, and I understand, you understand nothing. Tsunade snarled. Damn, now she was getting mad, and nothing burned the sake out of her system faster than getting angry. Jiraiya made a placating gesture with his hands, glancing around as their table started attracting attention from the rest of the bar. Can you at least just take a look at a genin for me, he pleaded. He was hit with a genjutsu, a powerful one. I think it caused some psychological trauma, but it's beyond my skills. Tsunade was a little taken aback, her anger fading. Usually the old fool's pride wouldn't let him fold so quickly. Damn, and she was sort of looking forward to a spat. Maybe she could push him a little further. So you acknowledge my superior skills? She asked in an arch tone. Jiraiya assumed an unusually serious expression. I have never once questioned your skills with medical jutsu, he said. Okay, so he didn't want to play at all. I see. Still, to bring a patient all this way. Her old teammate's mouth twisted. Well, actually, he'd come with us, to ask you about something else, when he was attacked, he admitted. Then he quickly added, that's a separate matter though. We can discuss that afterward. This, well, I'm asking it as a personal favor. I will owe you one. Tsunade frowned. In Jiraiya's personal code, annoying as it was, that was a major concession. Still, better to draw this out and see how serious he was. I thought I sensed some serious chakra usage earlier. If I wasn't retired, I don't know, tempting as having something to hang over you is, I'm not sure I want to get involved in whatever vendetta someone has against you. Jiraiya's face gave a flash of betrayal that actually made her feel a little guilty. But more surprising was the fact that the little girl who was with him spoke up. Please, Tsunade-sama, it isn't far from here, the Hyuga said in a subdued tone. How it must have grated to use such a humble voice. She probably didn't want the mission to fail and let Jiraiya out of whatever concessions he made to get the help of her clan. Well, maybe she could use that stiff-necked pride the Hyuga were known for. Maybe Jiraiya would owe her one. So, you want something from me as well? She asked. Okay, fine. My assistant Shizune here is getting a little too old to take care of mostly menial tasks. You agree to be my personal servant for 6 months and I'll see what I can do for this genin. She sat back, gently elbowing Shizune to shut her up. There was no way a Hyuga would agree to. With Jiraiya-sama's permission, I accept, Tsunade-sama. Oh hell. Naruto was normally a sound sleeper, but once he was awake, he was awake. Rousing himself once he was conscious was never a serious chore. And not one usually accompanied by a splitting headache, either. Until now. His eyelids felt like they'd been painted over with glue. Reaching up to rub at them was complicated by the fact that his arm seemed to weigh 1,000 kilos. Before he even got it halfway there, a cool damp cloth had been applied to his eyes, wiping the gummy secretions away. He knew without opening his eyes that Hinata was nearby. He bit back a groan as he tried to sit up, but his body was not cooperating. That wasn't good. Sensei would have his hide if he stayed in bed all day. Kurenai-sensei, is it true? He tried to ask, but all that came out was a rusty croak. A small, strong arm circled around his head, supporting it as it helped him to sit up. He opened his eyes as she brought a cup of water to his lips. The tears beating up in the corners of Hinata's lavender eyes seemed to already be answering his question. If Itachi had been lying to get him off balance, she'd already be assuring him that their Jonin-sensei was all right. So the even bigger Uchiha bastard wasn't lying. Yuhi Kurenai was dead. Naruto felt his body sag for a moment as despair surged through his spirit. The first adult to take his ambition seriously, and she was gone. No, she was taken. By the Uchiha, Itachi. Naruto felt his formerly sluggish chakra surge. With it came a wave of energy as his normal constitution seemed to kick in. He still felt a general dull ache, not dissimilar to what he'd felt in his arm after he destroyed Orochimaru's curse seal. He guessed that whatever happened after he was knocked out had strained his chakra coils to some degree. Surprisingly, Hinata didn't flinch back as he stiffened. She merely waited patiently as he greedily sucked down the water. She released his head as he sat up straighter and pushed back the covers he was sleeping under. He was relieved to find himself wearing a plain white sleeping tunic. He hoped Jiraiya had changed his clothes though. He glanced around and saw the woman they'd been tasked with finding holding green glowing hands over Sasuke's wrist. It's a simple fracture. He should lay off training for a couple of days to let it finish mending, she announced as the glow faded. The concussion should just be left alone for now. He'll be around in an hour or so. Naruto nodded. It was hard not to hate someone that resembled Itachi, but from what he'd learned of Konoha's recent history, Sasuke really hated his brother. Too bad he wasn't going to get a chance to kill him. Not if Naruto had anything to say about it. The woman who'd been identified in their briefing as Tsunade turned toward Hinata. You seem to have the basics down, she said with a grunt. Hope you plan to get used to taking care of sick people for the next 6 months. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he looked from her to his friend. What does that mean? He asked warily. Sensei was dead, but she was still depending on him to look out for his teammates. In return for my services, Tsunade answered with a smirk, Miss Hyuga has agreed to serve me for 6 months. Naruto scowled and turned toward Jiraiya, whose chakra he could feel loitering near the doorway. Beyond him, Naruto could see the shoulder of Shino's jacket. Just knowing he was nearby made Naruto feel a little better. Especially since he was likely listening to everything said for later analysis. The old pervert shrugged. That jutsu's damage was beyond my skills to repair, so I asked an old teammate to look at you as a personal favor. Instead, she asked your teammate for payment. Naruto grumbled and let out a sigh. In a way, this would keep Hinata from having to deal with her father for a while longer. At the same time, he didn't want her leaving Konoha, even temporarily. Of course, if Tsunade came back as Hokage, what about the mission? He asked Jiraiya. The Toad Sannin made a face and straightened up. Tsunade, there's another reason we're in town. We were looking for you. The blonde woman did not look nearly as surprised as the younger dark-haired woman standing off to the side in a black kimono. You always have an ulterior motive, Jiraiya, that's never changed. The white-haired man ignored the jibe. You might have heard that Konoha was recently attacked, he began. Sensei was hurt pretty badly and lost an arm. He's not dead, Tsunade said quickly. I'd heard he was mortally wounded. No, but his career as a shinobi is over, Jiraiya admitted. He paused. With everyone asleep during the battle, how did you hear he'd been killed? He was maybe a little too relaxed as he waited for her answer. Would she correct him? A wandering shinobi that was in the crowd, Tsunade replied, but Naruto thought her words lacked her earlier arrogance. Before he'd turned traitor, Orochimaru was her teammate, along with Jiraiya, under the old man. If the reports were true about him losing an arm, maybe Orochimaru had sought her aid as well. I see, Jiraiya replied, and Naruto wondered if he'd picked up on that too. Anyway, he sent me to find you and bring you back to Konoha. Tsunade shook her head. As old as he is now, there's no way I could regrow his arm without killing him. The shock from just debriding the stump would. Not to heal him, Jiraiya cut in. He knows he's too old. He wants you to replace him. The room was utterly silent for a moment, before Tsunade let out a contemptuous snort. Do you really think I'm that stupid, you old womanizer? She accused in a harsh tone. Or is this one of your moronic jokes? No joke, Haim, Jiraiya answered in a serious voice. His posture even straightened a little. He thinks you are the best choice to lead Konoha and rebuild its strength. After all Tsunade shook her head. No, it's impossible. I refuse. With every word, she shook her head harder, her words growing angrier. You'd have to be an idiot to want that job. In Naruto's defense, it should first be noted that he had made great strides in controlling his temper since his academy days. Kurenai Sensei's lessons featured multiple examples of shinobi in the past who had let their anger override their reason, often with tragic and messy results. On the other hand, Naruto had also recently suffered the loss of that same sensei, been subjected to a psychologically damaging S-rank genjutsu, was just informed that his best friend had sold herself into servitude to get a healer to repair the damage, and finally watched someone be offered the one thing he desired as long as he could remember. And rejected utterly. It's really no wonder at all that he snapped. Idiot, he demanded. The only idiot I see here is you. Watch it, brat. I just fixed you and I can unfix you just as easily. I'd like to see you try it, you old hag. Naruto smirked as her face colored. You didn't become a prankster of his skill without knowing how to home in on people's weak spots. If they were on the same genin team, she had to be as old as Jiraiya. To look as young as she did would require a genjutsu of some sort, which meant she was sensitive about her age. Senpai. No, the dark-haired woman cried as Tsunade gathered herself to lunge at Naruto's bed. We can't afford to pay for damages again. All right, Shizune. Tsunade snarled. Outside, you little snot, unless you are afraid to take your medicine. Fine, Naruto spat, grabbing the clothes piled beside his bed and marching toward the bathroom. He was just glad his convalescent wear included pants or it would have spoiled the effect. He came back out in less than a minute, having quickly made certain everything was in place. He paused as he was about to pick up his sandals. You really think you can take me? He asked, remembering his mission briefing on the target. With one finger, she snapped, turning away from Jiraiya who'd evidently been trying to talk her out of something. She stomped through the doorway and out into the hallway. The Toad Sannin rolled his eyes and shook his head mouthing something that looked like, blondes. Naruto grinned a little as he caught up to her. Why don't we make this a little more interesting? He asked as he and the medic Nin led an odd procession toward the hotel entrance. Tsunade's eyes narrowed. What stakes? She asked. If I win, you come back to Konoha, Naruto said. No way, she refused, shaking her head. So you're afraid you can't beat me? He taunted. What happened to one finger? Her eyes narrowed and Naruto was amazed he didn't burst into flames. Fine, she snapped. You know, I'm surprised you didn't ask me to forfeit your teammate's 6-month debt, she jabbed back. I guess the mission is more important than your teammate to you. And people wonder why I left. Not at all, Naruto shot back. I just want what's best for her. He paused. She probably didn't protest the debt too much, did she? He taunted. What's that supposed to mean? Tsunade demanded. Nothing you won't find out after you arrive in Konoha, Naruto assured her as they stepped out into the street. You are really getting on my nerves, boy, she snarled. Naruto turned back toward her after stepping off 10 paces. And you called my Hokage stupid, he snarled back as his eyes narrowed and he formed the ram seal. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Everything went silent as the street filled with clones, along with the rooftops to either side. Then a double tsunami of green engulfed the slug princess. Jiraiya decided to stay inside, having heard far too much about Naruto's exploits during the Sound Invasion. Intelligence estimates of exactly how many clones the overexcited Jinchuriki spawned while pursuing the Sand Genin were classified as an S-class secret, but from what he'd heard the boy must possess memories of working beside practically every member of Anbu before the fighting was concluded. The idea of being accidentally trampled by his subordinate was a little disturbing. But distinctly possible. Minato would never let him forget it if that ended up as his epitaph. Naruto's teammates hovered in the main entrance. Jiraiya didn't know what they expected to accomplish, other than provide moral support as his old teammate wiped the street with their friend. He just hoped he didn't have to sell another one of them into indentured servitude to pay the medical bill. Naruto hung back while his clones swarmed his opponent. Creating that many clones actually left him lightheaded for a moment, proof that he was still recovering from whatever Itachi had done to him. Unfortunately, Tsunade was annihilating them by the dozens. The really frightening part was that she was doing it with just the one finger as she specified. He didn't really want to find out what would happen if she struck him with that finger, but he suspected it would be as short as it was painful. Then the crazy alcoholic reached down and struck the street with that finger. The resulting shockwave blew all his clones off their feet and opened a fissure that arrowed toward him. Taijutsu or Dodenjutsu, it didn't matter. Naruto leapt backward, avoiding the seemingly bottomless rift, even as he raised his estimation of Tsunade's threat level. He started to understand why Oji-san wanted her as his new successor, despite her personality. Get back here, you little coward, she bellowed. If you run away, you forfeit. And maybe I'll take it out on my new assistant. Of course, that personality could be a weakness, Naruto thought as he gritted his teeth and charged back in. Tsunade grinned and set herself, right hand back, finger curled to the thumb ready to deliver a flick that would knock an ox into the next prefecture. But the genin stopped short and brought his hands together like he was about to begin a prayer. Naruto Majutsu. Chakra Pulse, he shouted, rotating his palms toward the slug princess in a throwing motion as he released the chakra he'd been gathering in his hara. The Sannin flinched back as the directed pulse wave washed harmlessly over her. Well, harmless to her body anyway. As Naruto suspected, she wasn't as young as she looked, concealing her age beneath a powerful genjutsu. One he had just disrupted. Naruto let out a laugh. Wow, you really are old, Ba-chan. In an instant, his air was cut off as her fingers closed around his throat. It really didn't help that he was still trying to laugh behind his blocked-off throat. The humor of the situation faded a bit as things started to grow dim and his peripheral vision started to gray out. He noticed Shizune pulling at Tsunade's shoulder, but not doing much to distract her. Then a mass of Kikai bugs engulfed her head and nobody can ignore that. She released Naruto, formed her fingers into a seal, and dispersed the cloud with a burst of chakra. He felt Hinata's hand steady his elbow as he gasped for breath, trying to blink the swirling motes in his vision away. However, when Naruto straightened up, he had a large grin on his face. He massaged his bruised throat as he assessed the middle-aged woman with a few wrinkles and blonde hair fading to silver. That was a lot more than one finger, Hokage-sama. Tsunade's eyes widened. You did all that, just to get me to break the terms of the wager. Naruto shrugged. It worked, didn't it? Or will you welsh on our bet? She scowled. You're an interesting little pipsqueak, but be honest. Did Jiraiya put you up to that? Naruto shook his head. No, I just remembered something Kurenai-sensei taught me. Tsunade murmured as she restored her genjutsu. I'll have to meet this sensei of yours. Naruto's face got a pinched look about it as Hinata let out a small hiccup. The Hyuga quickly walked back into the inn, Naruto following her, looking worried. The Aburame boy, Shino, turned to look at her, his face expressionless below his sunglasses. Unfortunately, you will not have that opportunity, was all he said. Jiraiya wasn't surprised when Tsunade cornered him. He was just surprised it took her so long. In her place, he didn't think he'd be able to control his curiosity as well. That was probably one of the reasons Sarutobi wanted her as his successor. That, and what he threatened to do if his sensei forced him into the role. Fortunately, they both agreed that what he was doing now was too important for Konoha to give up. Of course, given how painful large pieces of her own history was, it shouldn't be any wonder that she could be circumspect with the grief of others. If nothing else, he imagined she didn't want any reminders. After his victory, of sorts, Naruto stayed downstairs long enough to inhale some broth and steamed rice. Hinata was unusually insistent that he take it easy and go back upstairs to rest. Jiraiya wondered if she saw something in the boy's coils that worried her. For the brief moments it had been active, the Kyuubi had thrown around an enormous amount of chakra. If the brat wasn't so insanely tough, he'd be more worried about permanent damage. With the Aburame backing her, the Hyuga prevailed upon Naruto to return to his room to rest. Shizune followed along to supervise and Jiraiya found himself sitting at the bar next to an irritated Sannin. Mind explaining what the hell that was all about? She demanded after ordering another bottle of sake. Jiraiya sighed. Their Jonin-sensei was Yuhi Kurenai. Just passed the exam a few months ago. Uchiha Itachi tried to kidnap her, probably to use as bait for Naruto. Something went wrong and she was killed. We found out when they showed up here to try and grab him anyway. Tsunade let out a sound somewhere between a grunt and a groan. S-class or not, it takes a lot of balls to try and use a Jonin as a bargaining chip. Jiraiya nodded. The Aburame boy, Shino, says she managed to break one of Itachi's unbreakable genjutsu. He probably killed her to make sure she didn't tell anyone how. Damn, Tsunade cursed. You ever meet her? Jiraiya nodded. What was she like? Tsunade asked. He had no idea where this was going, but decided to play along. Besides being scary smart, stubborn, opinionated, and vindictive. She hated my books without reading a single one. Tsunade let out a snort of amusement. On the other hand, he continued, she was very, very focused on her genin. And it shows. She took 3 kids, one of whom barely passed the graduation test, and got them functioning at Chunin level or higher in just a few months. He didn't need to see her raised eyebrow to sense his teammates' disbelief. No joke. If the exams weren't interrupted, both boys would likely be wearing Chunin vests. The girl got knocked out of the preliminaries by her own cousin, a Jukin genius. Naruto returned the favor during the finals. Is he? Yeah, he's his. Not that it's hard to tell with the way he looks and that hair. Sensei said he's been telling everyone he was going to become Hokage since he learned what the word meant. First thing after graduation, his new sensei asks if he really wants to be Hokage, and then tells him what he needs to start doing to get there. Crazy brat started training 16 hours a day and by the exams he's learning a ranked jutsu and took down a Hyuga prodigy using taijutsu. You sound pretty proud of him, Tsunade said thoughtfully. Almost all the bitterness had leached out of her voice, and Jiraiya wondered if she was remembering her lost little brother, Nawaki. I am, he admitted, not that I have a right to be. Everything he and the Hyuga are, is mostly her doing. Now I have a question for you. What is it? She asked, her face guarded again. Are you going to abide by that wager? She gave him a flat look, but his own expression didn't soften. I'll think about it, she finally said. If nothing else, I should go back and see how bad a job they did healing Sensei. I might hear what he has to say. She shook her head ruefully. I can't believe I let him sucker me like that. Jiraiya smiled. That was more of a concession than he'd been expecting. These kids were good luck. Or maybe they reminded her. Speaking of suckers, Tsunade continued, breaking through his sake-fueled reverie, what is going on with that girl? Is she really a Hyuga? Jiraiya's mouth puckered, like he tasted something foul. I don't know all the details, he began, but I think you actually did her a favor. Sasuke woke up shortly after they returned to the room. He abruptly sat up, glancing around wildly, then holding his head and groaning. Hinata advised him of the analgesic powder Shizune dissolved in his water and suggested he drink it all. The last Uchiha looked like he wanted to protest, but his mouth stilled when he saw both Naruto and Shino staring at him. The air in the room was tense. It wasn't full of killing intent. Not quite. But if emotions had smells, the room would reek of them. Naruto figured it was probably a good thing Shizune was off feeding the pig. It would likely be going crazy in here by now. Sasuke sat up, drawing his legs in until he was sitting cross-legged on the mattress, holding his water in both hands as he slowly sipped it. Finally, he finished the water and spoke. I acknowledge your grievance against my clan, Sasuke said in a formal voice, reciting words that Naruto wondered if he'd memorized at some point. If his father was clan leader, had Sasuke already been in training on such formalities? He dismissed the thought as irrelevant, but stopped. It was something Kurenai-sensei would have wondered. Uchiha Itachi is a traitor to both Konoha and to the Uchiha clan, Sasuke continued, his voice flat, almost monotone. But he is still of my blood. I will kill him and avenge Yuhi-san along with all of the others. This I have pledged. His black eyes didn't meet theirs, instead staring off into the distance. Naruto realized, with a chill, that Sasuke wasn't really talking to them. His true audience had been dead for years. We accept your declaration, Shino said after a moment. It is widely known that Itachi does not act as an Uchiha any longer. You have also made it clear you plan to end his betrayal. Naruto turned to look at Shino. Was Sasuke seriously thinking they'd go after him because of Itachi? Or was this formal crap just to make sure everyone knew where they stood? Impolite or not, he wasn't going to let this pass. That's only if we don't find him first, he warned. Sasuke looked like he was about to say something, but held his tongue. A muscle jumped along his jaw and Naruto wondered if he was remembering how it got broken. Good enough. It was a subdued group that left for Konoha the following morning. Naruto found that a good night's sleep had washed away most of the lingering aches, except for the hollow throb of grief in the pit of his stomach. It seemed almost a betrayal to sleep peacefully after what had happened, but Hinata had mentioned that was probably his body recovering from what had happened. It surprised him, just a little, that she'd known what he was thinking after he woke up. But then again, she'd always been good at reading him, much better than he could read her. He grimaced as they walked down the street after checking out. She was a much better teammate than he was. As upset as he was, though, Naruto still felt uneasy for other reasons. As they left Atofika City, he thought he could feel unfriendly eyes watching them. With a few discreet hand signals, he alerted his teammates, but none of them could detect any hostile presences. Orochimaru Domo, Kabuto whispered, his head inclined respectfully, are we just going to let them leave? Now is not the time, the snake Sannin ground out, masking his killing intent only with great effort. They were hundreds of yards from the road, under a camouflage jutsu, but he still had to be careful he wasn't detected by his old teammates. Against both of my former teammates, especially with only one arm, I would be at a disadvantage, and I doubt you could stop that Genin team by yourself. They are just Genin, sensei, Kabuto murmured. They had seemed slightly competent to him when he encountered them during the Chunin examination, but surely not that much of a threat. At least one of them should be a Chunin, Orochimaru snapped. And the three of them were impressive when I was testing Sasuke-kun. Don't underestimate them. Kabuto ducked his head in apology. Besides, I don't want to risk any damage to my future vessel, the Sannin continued. Soon we will see if he will seek me out, given the proper inducements. With a new body, I'll have 2 arms again. Pity. I was so looking forward to corrupting the slug princess. Clouds were gathering overhead as they arrived back in Konoha. Conversation had been sparse on the return leg of their mission, which suited Naruto's mood. That was probably just as well, given the pace the 2 Sannin set. Even Shizune seemed a little short of breath as they descended from the tree line at the gates to Konoha. The Chunin on gate duty snapped to attention immediately. Jiraiya-sama, the Hokage requests that you report to his office immediately. Ero Sennin just nodded dully as they passed. Tsunade didn't even acknowledge the guards. Naruto knew from her reluctance that something was wrong with her, or at least with her past. He just hoped the old man could talk some sense into her. Naruto felt many eyes upon him as they made their way to the Hokage's tower. It was a little unnerving at first, until he remembered Sensei's lessons and tried to view the situation from their point of view. The death of a Jonin in a public place wouldn't have been kept secret for long, especially if she was going to have a public funeral as her rank required. From his peripheral vision, Naruto noticed that most of the scrutiny seemed to come from older villagers and shinobi, ones who likely knew he was a Jinchuriki. So they were watching to see how he reacted. Maybe they were worried he would lash out in anger at Sensei's death. Naruto almost snorted in amusement. Like he would demean her teachings by ignoring them now. He kept his face as impassive as possible. He would do his duty and make her proud. Wherever she was now, he could do no less. Jiraiya lingered at the back of the group. He didn't really think Tsunade would cut and run now. If nothing else, curiosity would keep her for a little while. Instead, he wanted to keep an eye on the kids without being obvious about it. The Hyuga's body language and posture were a little off. Given her reactions when the Hokage announced her stay with Kurenai was coming to an end, that was no surprise. The Aburame was as impassive as any of his clan when in public view. He was a little surprised to see a slightly sarcastic temperament displayed in private with his teammates, but he figured no one could remain stoic all of the time. He remembered putting together a dossier on the boy's mother before Shibi returned to Konoha from his posting. It hadn't looked like it at first, but her influence still might breathe some life into the Aburames before that emotionless exterior they cultivated made them truly inhuman. It was Naruto that was the real surprise. After his rage at Kurenai's death nearly unleashed the Kyuubi on Itachi, Jiraiya wasn't expecting the boy to hold it together this well in the village. Instead of glaring or even visibly grieving, he was just as impassive as the Aburame. Rather than being impressed, this made the Sannin a little worried as they entered the tower. He wondered if the boy's former teacher had the opportunity to speak to him about dealing with loss. Some might admire Naruto's ability to keep things bottled up, but Jiraiya considered them fools. He needed to talk to him, and soon. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. The old man looked like utter hell, and Tsunade looked like she wanted to throw everyone out of his office so she could examine him immediately. Teammate, Jiraiya informs me that you are already aware of what happened, correct? Sarutobi said, ignoring Tsunade's glare for the moment. When they nodded, he continued, the memorial service will be held tomorrow, at the Square of Remembrance. He shifted his gaze toward the Uchiha. Shino, your father confirmed that he'd granted permission for your trip, and Sasuke, you were well within your rights, but in the future I would request that you inform the Hokage's office if you see the need to travel outside the village in the future. Jiraiya's practiced eye caught the Uchiha's shoulders slumping a little in apparent relief. Surely he didn't think the village council would let the Hokage punish him too sharply. But then he remembered rumors about Kakashi's new training style. Maybe he was hoping the Hokage's acceptance of that legal fiction would keep him on the Jonin's good side. Then again, if the stories about Kakashi were true, leaving to warn a classmate of danger was one of the few reasons he might accept for being absent without leave. Then the genin were dismissed, while the Hokage asked his former students to stay. Jiraiya gritted his teeth and complied. Maybe he would be able to find his godson afterwards. Naruto went to bed early that night. He wasn't hungry and even skipped stopping at Ikiraku's after they'd been dismissed from the Hokage's office. Of course, going to bed didn't mean sleeping. Instead, he lay on his familiar old twin bed, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. He couldn't stop visualizing what had happened. Had it hurt, or was it too fast for her to feel anything? Did Sensei even have time to realize she'd broken one of the so-called invincible genjutsu? He hoped she'd at least had time to know that. But he'd never know for sure. He twitched as the latch on the window in his living room clicked. In a flash, Naruto was on his feet with the kunai he kept under his pillow. He peered through the slit of his not entirely closed bedroom door. The mane of white hair identified the bulky man climbing through his window. Not that anyone not a shinobi would be calmly climbing through a fifth-story window like that. If you're here for anything besides cup ramen and old mail, you're going to be disappointed, Naruto said flatly as he walked into the living room in his pajamas and nightcap. I'm too old to take up burglary, boy, Jiraiya shot back, not at all surprised he was detected. He straightened up and looked Naruto over, raising an eyebrow. You look like a fish is eating your head, he said after a moment of staring at Naruto's nightcap. It was a gift, Naruto said defensively. He thought the Hokage had left it on his doorstep one morning, but he'd never known for sure. So what can I do for you? He asked. I thought you might want to talk, Jiraiya said after a moment. Naruto peered at the older man for a moment. Why was he so concerned all of a sudden? Then he thought about his prisoner and his teeth began to grind together. Despite what happened with Itachi's jutsu, I am not going to willingly release the Kyuubi, he ground out. Jiraiya looked puzzled for a moment, and then horrified. No, that isn't what I meant, brat. The Sannin scowled, and then took a deep breath. I just thought you might want to talk. Alone. He made a face and looked down at Naruto's couch. I was older than you were when I started losing people in the war. The old my sensei talked to me about it. It helped some. Your sensei isn't around, and I made a promise. Naruto glared at him while his mind worked. In a way, it made sense. Hinata was at home, where Jiraiya was hardly welcome. Shino had his parents to talk to. Maybe he was just trying to help. Maybe everything wasn't about the damn fox. With an effort, he reined in his temper. I'm sorry, he said after a moment, would you like some tea? He had some instant stuff that wasn't too nasty, and Hinata had taught him at least the basics of etiquette. So they sat on the couch and talked. Naruto turned a blind eye to the face Jiraiya made when he sipped his tea and listened as the man talked about losing his favorite student, and how he felt when he'd arrived back in Konoha too late to do anything to prevent it. Naruto didn't say as much, but did ask some of the questions that had plagued him. Yes, Kurenai-sensei's death had been quick and painless. Yes, from Kakashi's report, she seemed aware that she'd overcome Itachi's genjutsu. Jiraiya even reached over and rapped him on the scalp when he said he wished he'd been there. Your sensei was a jonin, brat, facing one of the most dangerous missing nins of their generation, he growled. I doubt at this point you'd have been anything but a hindrance. Your job is to work your ass off and get good enough so that when you do get a chance, you can clean his fucking clock. Do you understand me? Naruto's fists clenched so tight he thought the skin would split. But he nodded his understanding. Does it ever get any easier? He asked after a moment. Not even a little, Jiraiya said. And if it ever does, then I don't want to know you. Understand. Naruto slowly nodded. Good, Jiraiya said. We get enough of that crap from Danzo's little cult. He says that the perfect ninja has no emotions, but people that practice that nindo never seem to last. They either completely lose their personality, or they crack like Itachi did. Naruto scowled at the reminder. He wondered if Jiraiya was doing that on purpose, maybe an enemy would mention Itachi just to provoke him. It was something to consider. Kurenai-sensei would do something like that. As the night wore on, the pauses between questions and answers grew longer and longer until Naruto finally drifted off to sleep. He was mildly surprised to wake the next morning tucked securely into his own bed. The weather the following day was appropriately gloomy. Storms had moved in during the night, and the morning dawned damp and overcast. Naruto found it appropriate as he slowly donned the plain black formal uniform that every shinobi was issued, but no one spoke of. The funereal garb was worn only if a shinobi of Jonin or higher rank was killed in service of the village. Such occasions demanded a formal memorial service. Not many attained such an exalted rank, and the loss of even one was a hard blow that must be acknowledged by the village as a whole. This tradition began with the founding of the village hidden in the leaves, and was still followed to the letter. Naruto stared at the dark fabric bunched in his hands. If the rumors were true, he nearly had to wear this for the old man's funeral. He squeezed his eyes shut as they burned. It wasn't fair. Why did she have to die when he wasn't there to do anything to stop it? The fine hairs on his forearms bristled as he felt his chakra circulate faster. With an effort, he calmed himself. He would not dishonor his sensei with an outburst, especially not today. He let out a shaky breath and thought about Jiraiya's words the previous night. Naruto shook himself and slowly got dressed. The reality of what he faced today made everything seem off. Almost dreamlike. Maybe part of him hoped this was all a bad dream he could wake up from. Even with no basis in reality, just the possibility made his pulse race. He clamped down on his emotions again. Jiraiya's words aside, this wasn't the time to give in to them. He dressed mechanically and made his way to the square at the appointed time. The overcast morning light seemed to leach the color out of everything it touched, making the horrible occasion seem even more unreal. It wasn't until he saw his teammates that everything became real for Naruto. Shino stood as still as a statue, flanked by his parents. Hinata's blank white eyes were rimmed with red. The Hyuga was flanked by her cousin and father. While Neji stood at her elbow, his presence was at worst neutral. Her father, on the other hand, fine wrinkles gathered at the corners of his eyes. While his eyes were as pupilless as any Hyuga's, his attention seemed to be fixated on his eldest child as she held herself stiff and still. Given what he heard of the clan elder, he was probably searching for any crack in Hinata's public veneer, so he could reprimand her later. Bastard. His appearance, along with the more welcome presences of Shibi and Misato, also served to remind Naruto that with no family, he stood alone. He glanced toward the podium, where Jiraiya and Tsunade flanked the Hokage. Jiraiya looked uncomfortable, but didn't move. Naruto flinched a little when a hand came down on his shoulder. Iruka-sensei was there, flanked by Konohamaru and his friends. The scar-nosed Chunin gave his former student a sad smile. Konohamaru was uncharacteristically pale and silent. Naruto supposed the death of an adult who'd rescued him was a hard blow. Naruto gave them both a firm nod and straightened his spine a little. A light drizzle fell as everyone assembled into ranks and the old man gave a short speech. Naruto couldn't recall a single word of the eulogy. Instead, his eyes sought out the framed photograph of Yuhi Kurenai that was placed on a fabric-covered stand at the front of the square. Naruto wondered if she knew what this picture would be used for when it was taken. Her brows were slightly drawn together in a frown of concentration, her features displaying the ferocious intelligence with which she approached everything. Sensei didn't accept mysteries in life. Everything could make sense, and would make sense if she had enough time to figure it out. The realization hit him like a kick to the stomach. Now she had no more time, and she wouldn't be figuring out anything else, ever again. Whatever she had that let her see him, see the real him, and believe in him, that was gone, gone forever. He didn't even realize he'd fallen to his knees until the damp pavement soaked through the fabric. Hinata had managed, with some subtle assistance from Neji, in avoiding her father for most of the previous evening. But tradition required the clan to travel to the memorial service as a group. She felt her father's eyes on her the entire way. She didn't know if he knew about her pledge to Tsunade-sama yet. She imagined not, since he hadn't said anything to her yet. It hadn't occurred to her at the time, but on reflection knew he'd take offense. Surprisingly, she didn't care. There were plenty of reasons she'd done it. A ploy to get the future Hokage interested in the village. A desperate desire to see Naruto restored to consciousness. But in her heart of hearts, Hinata knew the truth. The moment the older woman had suggested her fee, Hinata immediately accepted because she knew it would be 6 months that she wouldn't have to return home. To a place she no longer saw as home. She inhaled slowly, willing her hands to still the trembling that threatened to show. If she wasn't working 24 hours a day, she would still be able to see Naruto. Training with him would only make her a more valuable servant, so Tsunade probably wouldn't object. Her objections made sense, unlike others. Not having to go home. Still being able to see Naruto and Shino. It would be almost as good as the time she spent with Kurenai-sensei. Hinata swallowed, the skin around her eyes growing fever warm. The time she'd spent, convalescing, after she was discharged from the hospital was one of the best times she could remember. The only times that approached it had been when she was very young and her mother was still alive. Father was distant, but not the looming angry presence he was now. He seemed content to leave her to her mother. A mother that didn't seem distressed at Hinata's shyness. She and Sensei had talked for hours, especially that first night. Their first conversation after her fight with Neji had left them awkward, with things between them that could never be unsaid. But Sensei had explained why, and her reasons made sense. Hinata was horrified at her teacher's predictions of Naruto and Shino's actions if she had found the death she sought. But at the same time, a small corner of her soul wondered aloud at the thought of anyone valuing her life so much. Their talk had consumed the entire evening and left Hinata drained of energy, but as she dropped off to sleep, she also felt lighter in spirit than she could ever remember. After that, they were more comfortable around each other, like some barrier had been broken down. Kurenai-sensei was very rigorous in her supervision of Hinata's breathing exercises, but her supervision was interspersed with praise, rather than reminders of the foolishness that led to her injury. It bothered Hinata so much that she finally asked Sensei about it. Hinata, you know what you did wrong, what good would it do to keep reminding you of it? Kurenai had asked in return. It was such a simple question, but it stopped the Hyuga girl in her tracks. What good did it do? What good did it do when her father berated her over and over for every mistake? What good did it do when he reminded her of her failures before every match with her sister? What good did it do to make sure she was always aware of what a failure she was? No good at all. Then why did he do it? Hinata clenched her fists at her sides as the eulogy ended. The weather finally broke, a soft drizzle falling on the assembled mourners. She looked at the portrait of her sensei, and recalled their last private conversation. Sensei had told her how proud she was of her recovery and the way she'd helped her teammates. Then she asked her specifically to watch out for Naruto. That puzzled Hinata, as by now she was sure he was the better fighter. But Kurenai simply smiled and shook her head. That's not the kind of help I think he needs the most, was all she said. Hinata still wasn't sure what that meant, but since then she'd seen how badly he'd been affected by the news of Sensei's death. Not all hurts were physical, and it scared her a little to see how badly it cut into him. Her Byakugan was not active, but motion at the edge of her vision still caught her attention. She swallowed hard as Naruto's legs buckled and his knees hit the pavement. Iruka-sensei squeezed the boy's shoulder, but Konohamaru glanced around, looking a little panicked. Hinata was moving before she even thought about it. She felt her father's eyes boring into her back, but nothing in the world would stop her from fulfilling Sensei's last request. Naruto swallowed the hot bile burning the back of his throat as he felt the sense of loss roll over him. If this is what it lead to, maybe that Danzo guy wasn't as stupid as Jiraiya thought. He simultaneously wanted to scream, throw up, and run over and tear that casket open. He wanted to see Kurenai again, and shake her until she woke the hell up and... His jumbled thoughts cut off as a small but strong pair of arms wrapped around his neck. His head was cool from the steadily strengthening rain, but his eyes felt hot and his vision was too blurry to see now, but he knew it was Hinata, and her father was going to freak out on her and... Biting back a sob, he wrapped his arms around her waist and squeezed her like a drowning man would hold a life preserver. His eyes screwed shut, he could hear the steady pound of her heart through her jacket. The sound seemed to soften the jagged shards of grief ripping through his insides. His whole body shook as hot tears poured from under his closed eyes. He didn't want to open them, knowing they'd be red for more than one reason. Then another arm draped across his shoulders and the sound of Hinata's heartbeat was joined by an agitated, but steady hum. Shino's hives, Naruto realized in an instant. He let out a shuddering breath. No, he wasn't alone. He'd never be alone. The sound of teeth grinding was audible from several feet away. Hyuga Hiashi had seemed shocked, at first, at his daughter's violation of proper decorum. Especially as it was to comfort an ill-bred piece of trash that clearly had no idea how to behave in public. He settled for glaring at her for a moment. Hopefully, when she looked back, she'd see his expression and realize the gaffe she had committed. That way she would know to return to her proper place without him having to break protocol as well. Except she didn't turn around. Or even look back. His sense of outrage building, Hiashi was about to step forward to retrieve his errant child when he blinked in confusion. The Aburame boy was standing with them as well now, engaging in very unusual behavior for one of his clan. Had that wretched brat infected his entire team with the seeds of madness? He shook his head. That was a problem for the boy's parents to deal with. He had his own daughter to discipline. It was at this moment that two shinobi, both wearing the formal black tunic and pants, stepped forward, flanking him on each side. Hiashi froze at the sudden violation of his personal space. He could banish them in an instant with a Kaiden, but to do so now, for anything less than an actual assassination attempt, was unthinkable. And that was a remote possibility, at best, as he recognized both men. To his right, Hitaki Kakashi spoke first. His lips barely moved under his ever-present mask, but the words were clear. Appropriate weather for a funeral, he said. I suppose. Sarutobi Asuma rumbled, a little louder. Rather not have any at all. True, Kakashi agreed. Still, it's nice to see such a strong turnout. Making Jonin is hard work, something that people should recognize, even if they never see us doing our jobs, nay. If we do it right, no one ever sees us, Asuma agreed. Kakashi nodded. Good to see that respect. It's important, especially since Kurenai was one of us, right, Asuma? Right, Kakashi. Kakashi nodded again. Good to see her team together like that. Shows how much she will be missed. Hiashi made a sharp inhalation. If he thought the humiliation of the Hyuga clan was some sort of tribute to, they're doing better than I did, Kakashi added, seemingly as an afterthought. When my sensei died, I went on a bender, just so I'd be too drunk to attend the ceremony. I didn't know that, Asuma added quietly. Things were really a mess back then, I doubt anyone really noticed. I'm sure sensei understood, Kakashi murmured. Anyway, he added in a firmer voice, I know you have no wish to do anything that might seem disrespectful to Kurenai-san's memory, so you'll stay right here and leave her team alone to say goodbye as they wish to. You have no right to interfere with my clan, Hiashi hissed under his breath. No, I don't, Kakashi agreed. But I do have a right to share any jutsu I've acquired. You know, copycat ninja Kakashi, and all that. Bingo book says I know over 1,000. He shrugged eloquently. I know of at least 24 that can neutralize or otherwise bypass eye bloodlines, like the Byakugan. Iruka's always after me to contribute some jutsu to the academy curriculum, especially for their advanced jutsu workshops. Hiashi froze in place. He turned his head fully toward the former Anbu captain. That's treason, he said harshly. No, not at all. I'm providing these to the village as a whole. Just because everyone else in the village learns how to fight against the Byakugan, if they have to, doesn't make it treason against Konoha, does it? I don't have anything half so elegant, Asuma added. I'll just kick your ass if you take one step towards those kids. Hiashi turned toward the more direct threat. Do you really think you can do that? He asked with a sneer. A few days ago, Asuma replied in a low tone as the rear ranks of the assembly slowly departed. The two of us were fighting two of the most dangerous missing nins in the world. We were out of position or too slow to save a valued comrade from being killed. Now here you are, someone she clearly despised, trying to make an ass of yourself and disrupt her funeral. He paused. How can we not? Hiyashi barely stopped himself from lashing out at the fool and making an even bigger spectacle of himself. You haven't heard the last of this, he snarled. Kakashi merely nodded thoughtfully. Come, Neji, Hiyashi commanded, and stalked toward the back of the memorial square. Neji nodded and followed. His expression did not change as he caught the eye of his own sensei, who had a somber expression, but still spared his student a nod.